So say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a look at a Creation Today show. Creation Today is the ministry of Eric Hovind, the younger and estranged son of Kent Hovind. His guest is John Sanford, a former plant geneticist turned dishonest pseudoscientific hack. This video is going to go into mostly things about human genetics and how, according to John Sanford, that supports the literal existence of Adam and Eve some 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Without further ado, here's Eric.
It was in 1869 that DNA was discovered by Swiss researcher Friedrich Miescher.
I want to point out that at that time, no one knew what DNA did, and they certainly didn't know it was a double helix. Eric's on-screen image seemed to imply otherwise.
Since then, the more we learn about it, the more fascinated we are by it.
Yeah, DNA is pretty darn cool, as is genetics.
So my question for us today, can DNA, can genetics, can the information that is inside each and every one of us provide evidence or even potentially a timeline that demonstrates the truth of the biblical worldview?
First, there is no such thing as the biblical worldview. There are biblical worldviews, but none of them have a special claim to being the special one biblical worldview, and this is because the Bible is a contradictory text with no one view of God, sin, or salvation. Any worldview constructed from it will have to prioritize some views within the Bible while contradicting others, which are then usually hand-waved or reinterpreted. Second, no biblical worldview can be supported by genetics unless it's a worldview that is willing to adapt to scientific findings, which Eric's is not.
Do our genetics start with Adam and Eve?
No, they do not. All attempts to demonstrate otherwise rely on ignoring data, misusing data, and usually dishonesty.
In order to answer that question, I'm going to need somebody a lot smarter than me to give me some help, okay?
That's a low bar.
Our guest today was a professor at Cornell University and is the inventor of the gene gun. He's the founder and former president of Logos Research Associates, and he has a fascinating story. And he's truly brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. John Sanford. Dr. Sanford, welcome to the Creation Today show.
Thank you very much.
I love your story because you were not always a believer in Christ. Can you give us a quick summary of your story?
I'll go out on a limb and predict that the story is that he converted to a branch of Christianity for reasons unrelated to any scientific evidence for a young Earth, or that evolution is impossible, and only after finding that that reality was theologically uncomfortable did he decide that reality was in fact negotiable, leading him to become a pseudoscientist.
A quick summary. I remember being a little child and looking up at the blue sky through the leaves of our tree and having a God moment. I remember several God moments when I was just a child.
Who cares? Someone connected his adult religion to experiences of awe in childhood. That's great for him, but it's probably not why he decided that science was wrong and bad, actually.
By the time I was in high school, I loved science, and I was being taught that science is antithetical to God.
I highly doubt that. What's more likely is that he is retroactively reinterpreting his science instruction that is at odds with his reality denial as being anti-God. In reality, I bet his teachers were probably themselves Christians, since statistically that's extremely likely, especially given Sanford's age.
And so I became an atheist in high school, and I was a rabid atheist in college.
Oh good, we get to see what a cringy edgelord Reddit atheist type is like when they become a creationist hack. My guess is that the edge was blunted, but that the cringe remained.
And along the way, a number of people touched me in a way that
Made him feel funny in his special place?
made me rethink. And the most important one was my wife.
And that was supposed to be a joke, but I'm guessing in her case it was more literal.
And so neither one of us were saved when we got married, but we really loved each other. But that started to break down about 10 years into our marriage. And my wife had common sense to go to church for the first time. She'd never been in a church her whole life. And
Okay, so Sanford was in a family marriage, which put his wife into emotional turmoil, and she sought out comfort in a church. All pretty understandable. Also, nothing to do with, scientific evidence.
anyway, I started to tag along with her, just kind of out of curiosity. We both fell in love with Jesus. It was really very beautiful road that we traveled on.
Well, now that Sanford is a throuple with his wife and Jesus, I suspect we're close to the reality denial part.
And things were working much better. But I hadn't been saved yet. So I was baptized when I was 39, and we were baptized together.
Man, evangelical soteriology is both so simple and also weirdly arcane. Like, it involves belief in Christianity, but also there needs to be some kind of singular conversion experience. You can't simply start believing, or have always believed and join the church, and there you go. There has to be that moment. I can tell you from experience that this means that kids raised in this kind of religion end up having anxiety over whether or not they're saved, because they rarely have a conversion moment, since they were raised as part of the religion.
And for me, pastor said, to receive Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And our little liberal church said, like to talk about Jesus as our Savior. But when he said, will you submit to Jesus for the rest of your life? My inner brain just exploded.
Could he talk any slower?
Took me about 1 second, and I said yes.
Wow, look at that. My prediction was right. At this point, it's basically a tale as old as time. Some person with a decent education converts to a version of Christianity for which basic reality and science are uncomfortable for emotional reasons. Then later they decide that their emotional needs are at odds with reality, so they decide that it's reality that's wrong, and they're going to go become a reality-denying creationist to deal with that cognitive dissonance. The much rarer, to the point I'm not sure it's ever happened, version would be someone who realized for scientific reasons that the universe is only 6,000 years old, and or that evolution is actually fake, and only then do they realize that there's been a religion saying that the whole time.
And when I came out of the water, I was radically changed.
Heightened emotional experiences will do that, but you'll note that being dunked underwater in a religious ceremony isn't actually evidence for a young Earth, or that evolution is fake, or that Adam and Eve were real persons who lived 6,000 years ago.
It's just amazing. And so my wife and I have been growing ever since. But the first 10 years after baptism, I was embracing things of church, the things of God. But I didn't know what to do with evolution because I had been an evolutionist all my life.
And yeah, now we know my prediction was completely accurate. So let's remember, this whole thing was that there was never an evidential reason for Sanford to abandon reality and become a nutcase. It was a purely emotional decision. And of course, it couldn't really be otherwise because there is as much evidence supporting young Earth creationism as there is the flat Earth. They're both ludicrous concepts that are only believed for bad reasons.
And I didn't think there was any other possible choice. I'm thinking, well, there must be some way to fit evolution into this story.
And he could have done it very simply by recognizing that the histories of Genesis 1 through 11 are not actual records of real events, and cannot be since they aren't even a single coherent narrative, but numerous contradictory narratives cobbled together. Genesis 1 and 2 are separate creation stories that disagree on the basic order of creation. In one part of Genesis, Cain and Abel are the only other humans other than their parents. Later, though, Cain has the possibility of running into fully populated cities and also just randomly managed to get a wife, indicating that the world is in fact full of people. If you have a favorite Bible contradiction, put it in the comments. But no, Sanford has to defend both the historicity of the whole Bible, which also requires it to be free of contradictions. And this is where Bible-based nonsense usually starts. With the insistence that the Bible must contain only one history of the world, but that it may not be internally contradictory, and that the history really happened. Since that's not even plausible based on just the text of the Bible without reference to external evidence, it should be glaringly obvious that such attempts will contradict science even more strongly.
10 years later, I've talked to many creationists who have have the similar experience. They get saved, and then they don't know what to do with their
Evidence-based beliefs, critical thinking skills, and the capacity for rational thought?
background of evolution is true.
Right, so their evidence-based beliefs, critical thinking, and capacity for rational thought. I think I'm batting 1,000.
And they all do, it's all for all of them, they grow through it, they break through the barrier. Usually it takes a couple of years, and then they go with it.
So it takes about 2 years for someone to finally abandon a concern for evidence when it comes to things like history and science. I had the exact opposite experience. It took me about that long to get rid of creationism once I decided I cared about evidence. I guess it makes sense that it would be a similar in reverse.
Fully surrendering to Christ and to Scripture.
It is impossible to fully surrender to Scripture. Christian scriptures are not internally consistent, and any attempt to figure out a single history of the world or theological framework from them of necessity requires that one ignore or at least downplay parts of the Bible. For example, most creationists have decided that the order of creation and duration of creation in Genesis 1 overrules the different order and duration of creation in Genesis 2. They have decided to ignore basically most of the theology of the Epistle of James in favor of an exaggerated version of the faith-based salvation of Ephesians. They pick and choose which bits of the Torah's law code are important. For example, they find prohibitions against male homosexual acts compelling, but not the fact that the same books also treat an unborn fetus as property and not a person.
Wow.
So that happened to me. And I remember sitting in the living room with a pile of evolution books and a pile of creation books. And I thought they both have really good, sound positions. And
I'm skeptical of this story. I suspect that what actually happened is that he knew that the evolution side had actual good positions, but his dedication to his tradition's view of the Bible made him extremely charitable and credulous about the claims of his co-religionists. I can't prove that that's what happened, but it's at least plausible, since basically any creationist argument I've ever seen has needed little more than an introductory course in the subject it is about in order to thoroughly debunk it.
But these guys are my enemy, and these guys are my brethren.
Yep, I was right again. Who cares about the evidence? He imagines some malice from evolutionary biologists that I can pretty much guarantee they don't actually feel. And on the other hand, there are people who believe like he does, who couldn't possibly have bad motivations. This is just tribalism, and it's one-sided. At least among the evolutionary biologists I know, they don't really care if people are Christian or not, and one of them would actually prefer that people be Christian rather than not. This whole section of the interview is just Sanford admitting that he has no actual good reasons to abandon science, and creationism basically just makes him feel good, so he'll go with it. I doubt, though, that he'd find that acceptable if someone told him that their reason for their testimony that the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God was that they felt it to be true in their heart. In that case, I bet he would be able to call that out as a bad reason.
And I thought, well, I guess this isn't such a hard decision. And so again, it was a God moment, and it catapulted me into the creation movement.
I don't know if I could hold up a more clear example of the fact that you have to be intellectually bankrupt to be a young Earth creationist who's well-educated.
Wow, that is amazing, is it?
What's amazing about a man making a stupid decision for stupid reasons? People have been doing that since people were a thing. That decision by Sanford was stupid, but it was also right in line with both confirmation bias and in-group bias, so it's actually pretty expected. It takes a lot of effort to actually overcome human cognitive biases, and most people fail at least some of the time. The only thing that's exceptional about this is that Sanford definitely knew better, yet he decided that the evidence and reality were secondary to his theology. Essentially, he knows deep down somewhere that he's wrong. In fact, I suspect it might be closer to the surface than one might expect, given that he's also been known to lie about the work of other people, especially Charles Darwin and Moto Kimura, which he probably wouldn't do if he didn't know that he couldn't actually support his claim honestly.
It is hard for some people when you've been brought up with what you think is science, because evolution is presented as, well, this is science. Is that kind of where the crux of how can I let go of, because you're thinking it's science. It feels like I'm letting go of science. Is that kind of where the struggle is?
I don't know if that's where Sanford's struggle was, but it was certainly where mine was. Except that I had all my life been presented with creationism as science, and then I took it upon myself to actually look into the topic. I went to see what the rebuttals were from the other side, and to see what their responses were. And in my case, accepting evolution was not in line with either my confirmation or in-group bias. Indeed, after it became well known that I had accepted science in my church, it strained relationships. There were numerous attempts to get me to rejoin the young Earth creationist fold, none very successful. Also, interestingly, my rejecting the pseudoscience of creationism in no way changed my religious affiliation. It did change eventually, more than once, but that's not relevant, and it took something like a decade before I left evangelical Protestant Christianity for something else.
Yes, I mean, basically, we are deceived by the world, and we need to break through it.
Pretty rich from the guy who lied about Kimura's fitness distribution by pretending it disregarded beneficial mutations because they were insignificant, instead of the real reason, because positive selection would swamp any neutral evolution signal if they were included. And from the guy who said that sections of The Origin of Species were in German and that the book had no math, both of which are just false. I would love to see what specific lie he's talking about, because, you see, when I say that John Sanford is a liar, I have actual specific things that I can show he said, and show how they're not true, and show good reason as to why John Sanford knows that they're not true. For instance, in order to make such extensive use of Moto Kimura's graphs, Sanford either read his work and knows he's not representing it accurately, or he's citing it without having read it, which is itself just lying about whether he's read it. When it comes to lies about Charles Darwin, again, if he read the book, then he knows that what he's saying isn't true, and since he represents himself as an authority when talking about The Origin of Species, if he has not read it, then he's just lying about having done so. Instead of actually spelling out what the lies are and how he knows, I'll bet he's just going to say that since evolution is the work of Satan, the father of lies, it's just full of lies.
And God helps us, but we need to be part of the formula.
Did he just say, be part of the formula? I honestly have listened to this several times, and I can't really tell what he's saying. Sanford could benefit from some public speaking courses, I think.
And so it is difficult. But as soon as I made that decision, I knew it was the right one.
Of course you would feel that way. It's always comforting to decide that, in fact, your biases were the right biases, and the thing you wanted to be true was true. But reality doesn't actually care what you want to be true, and there is a lot about reality that I don't really like. If you feel good about a belief, then you should probably take that as a reason to go back and really examine that belief. I have found that more often than not, what I want to be true is not what is true. Heck, I still wish young Earth creationism were true. That would answer all sorts of philosophical, historical, and scientific questions that I do not have the answers for, or that I have answers for that I don't like. Sure, it would also entail some things that I do not like, but whatever.
And the first thing I thought of was, well, what can I do? And then I thought, well, maybe I could do something with genetics.
Which brings us to where we are now, with Sanford being one of the better educated and hence less honest creationists out there.
And so I started to think about that. And actually, it was really interesting because I started to rethink the evolutionary heroes of the day.
That's such a weird thing to me. Science doesn't really have heroes. It has pioneers, sure, people who are the first to come up with what would later be important scientific concepts. But what matters is not the persons who do the science, but ultimately the evidence. If it turned out that Newton, Galileo, and Darwin were absolutely awful, horrible, no good, very bad people, that wouldn't actually matter to science. Indeed, in some ways, Galileo was in fact a dick. Yet, that's not really a problem for our model of the solar system.
And what I saw was that a lot of the founders of neo-Darwinian theory were really hotshot intellectuals.
Oh, fun! A dose of anti-intellectualism. Nothing says, I am very smart, like deciding that people who know what they're talking about, as a result of years of study and demonstrable expertise, are in fact wrong because of that very study and expertise. No wonder creationist organizations are having problems with their fans turning out to be anti-vaxxers and flat earthers. They learned how to deny reality and expert advice from the creationists themselves.
But they actually all expressed uncertainty that they could fully explain what's happening.
In other words, they were all scientists who were appropriately cautious about their conclusions and didn't leap to unfounded levels of confidence like they had the backing of God. Oh, wait. Yeah. That's exactly the problem. They weren't pretending that they were speaking for the Almighty, when creationists do pretend that.
One of the things that I learned was that one of the most famous ones, Mueller, said if human beings have more than one mutation per person per generation, evolution cannot work. We are all on our way down.
Except that he did not say that, not even a little. Muller is most famous for a similar idea called Muller's ratchet, which says that in a population in which there is no genetic recombination, that is, a haploid asexually reproducing population, there are no ways to isolate beneficial mutations from deleterious ones, and since on average far more mutations will be deleterious than beneficial, such populations must tend towards lower fitness, and therefore declining population size, since, definitionally, lower fitness means less population. You might notice that humans are neither haploid nor asexual in terms of reproductive strategy, even if some humans are asexual in terms of personal behavioral preference. Humans reproduce sexually, and this allows for recombination, which means that beneficial mutations can accumulate in a genome, with deleterious mutations being eliminated by selection. Even microbes, the context in which Muller was actually working, undergo forms of mutation and sexual reproduction on occasion, which allows for them to accumulate beneficial mutations while removing deleterious mutations from the genetic background containing the beneficial mutations. Now, that does also mean that many single-celled haploid organisms simply will not reproduce due to the effects of Muller's ratchet. And that is just true. Trillions of bacteria and other single-celled organisms die all the time while failing to reproduce. Muller's ratchet has never applied to organisms like humans, and I find it hard to believe that Sanford does not know this.
From one mutation, because one mutation adds to another, adds every generation you have more and more mutations. He said that would be deadly.
Yes, but only because the populations he was describing had no option to remove those mutations short of the death of the whole organism. Humans are not in that situation. It is a simple fact that virtually every human on Earth is heterozygous for numerous horrific genetic diseases that are each rare on their own, but collectively common enough that virtually all individuals are assured to have at least some such alleles. Because they are recessive, this normally does not cause a problem, but it is also possible for a human to simply not pass that allele on to one of their offspring. For example, suppose that you were heterozygous for an allele on chromosome 3 that, if expressed, would cause death at a young age. Let us also suppose that on the same chromosome you have an allele that is beneficial, perhaps protecting you from some degree of cancer or heart disease. You may expect that any of your offspring must inherit both or neither of those alleles, but this is wrong. During meiosis, the process that results in gametes or sex cells, that is, eggs and sperm, chromosomes will undergo crossover, such that the resulting chromosome 3 in the gametes will actually be a mix of both of your chromosome 3s. This means that some of your gametes' chromosome 3 will have only the deleterious allele, and some only the beneficial one, and some will have both or neither. Further, because your offspring will also inherit chromosomes from your reproductive partner, your grandchildren can inherit beneficial alleles from both you and your partner on the same chromosome, since your children's chromosomes will also undergo crossover during gametogenesis. Now, of course, just like the mutations that produce all these alleles, this crossover is stochastic, and there is as much chance that one of your grandchildren will suffer from an accumulation of deleterious alleles, but that is where selection comes in. In that case, the grandchildren with an overaccumulation of deleterious alleles will reproduce less, meaning that evolution can segregate beneficial alleles even when they arise on the same chromosome as deleterious alleles, and also promote the propagation of such beneficial alleles without in the long term propagating the deleterious alleles originally linked to them. In this way, deleterious mutations are not additive in the long run in sexually reproducing populations like humans. Further, Sanford's claim that each mutation is going to be deleterious ignores that most mutations are in fact neutral, and so even if they did have purely additive effects that persisted through time, they would not be as dangerous as he indicates. Further, it is not the case that all variations have an additive effect. Some mutations can be deleterious except in the presence of yet another mutation, which on its own may even be deleterious, yet taken together can be advantageous. Basically, Sanford is wrong at every step.
And so, and then many high-level scientists.
Okay, so remember, we're talking levels 16 through 20 scientists here. Level 12 scientists can get out of here. We don't need them.
Who built the Darwinian idea, not the idea, but really the science, what they considered the science.
Okay, so I guess just Darwin then? Because let's remember, everything like genetics, mutation, niche construction, drift, etc., that's all post-Darwin, and it's not Darwinian. Darwin was not the end of evolutionary biology. It was basically the very beginning. We've come a long way since Darwin, and Darwin himself would probably barely recognize modern evolutionary biology.
All had places in their life where it didn't make sense, or where they were just simply in error.
Yeah, they're scientists, not gods. Humans aren't perfect and they make mistakes. Scientists aren't immune to this.
Fisher was a really famous, he was the first one to create what was called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Really brought science to it. Darwin didn't bring science, he brought philosophy to it.
Yeah, except for all those experiments and expeditions to gather data. Let's just ignore those things.
So like 50 years later, Fisher brought what he thought was the science.
The funny thing is that the primary thing added to evolutionary biology when the neo-Darwinian synthesis was being formed was genetics. And so by Sanford dismissing the additions to Darwinian evolution as what he thought was the science, he's essentially implying that genetics isn't science. Of course, Sanford is himself a trained geneticist, so I guess Sanford is saying that he's not a scientist since genetics isn't science. It's almost like he didn't think this one through.
And one of my colleagues, not so many years ago, and I looked at his work and discovered that it had a huge flaw, huge flaw. And when we corrected it, it meant that Fisher said the theorem that he presented was ensured that everything would always keep evolving upward. And when we corrected his mathematical error, everything goes down.
First, I just have to say that Eric grinning like an idiot creeps me out something fierce. Second, Sanford is alluding to his 2018 paper, The Fundamental Theorem of Natural Selection with Mutations, which he co-authored with William F. Basner. Rather amusingly, the paper claims to have overturned an obscure theorem in evolutionary biology by adding a term for mutation to the derivation of the theorem. Of course, the reason that's rather amusing is that there was always a term for mutation in the theorem. It's a barred lowercase delta, which means that they never actually understood the theorem in the first place. They then pretended that their work showed that fitness in any population should always decline. The problem with this, though, is that it does not match reality. So even if they were right that the original math was incomplete, their conclusion cannot be right, because reality doesn't agree. And in science, whenever anything, whether it be Sanford's math or the text of the Bible, disagrees with reality, the thing is wrong and should be dismissed. Further, a full refutation of the paper was written by friends of the channel Zach B. Hancock and Dan Stern Cardinal, which show that even with Sanford and Basner's absurd assumptions like fixed fitness effects, etc., they can still get sustained fitness increases in populations, even with mean positive fitness effects as low as 0.001, and with a population cap of only 1,000, and with a beneficial mutation rate as low as 1%. This means that while being absurdly generous to the creationist position, they still saw sustained fitness increase in simulated populations, something Sanford insists is impossible. So math, theory, and reality all say Sanford is just dead wrong about all of this. One group of people who are not dead wrong about all of this are my supporters. If you're enjoying the video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Additionally, if you want to support the channel financially, there are some great ways to do so, like Patreon linked in the description, which starts at only $1 a month, and you can get a 15% discount for paying annually. The memberships can be joined with the join button below this video, that starts at $1.99 a month, and both give you access to my super secret Discord server, and early access to my scripted videos. There are higher tiers for more perks.
Wow.
We completely reversed Fisher.
Yes, if the paper is taken at face value, but of course, if you actually look into it, all they did was play with numbers in inappropriate ways based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Fisher's theorem. And even then, their math doesn't actually work out or match reality, so oops.
And he's probably one of the most famous scientists ever.
This is entirely unimportant, but that's just a really weird thing to say. Compared to Gregor Mendel, Charles Darwin, Galileo Galilei, Albert Einstein, all of whom are household names, Fisher is barely known outside of evolutionary biology. And even then, most evolutionary biologists have never heard of his theorem, because all it does is show that under certain conditions, fitness will increase, which isn't exactly controversial. Nor was that ever really contested in evolutionary biology. The only reason Sanford cares about it is because, as the guy who invented so-called genetic entropy, he cares very much that fitness decrease under essentially all conditions, which we know experimentally to be false. But he figured if he could play funny games with math and submit a paper about that to a journal that doesn't really have a lot of population geneticists to ask for peer review, then he could backdoor genetic entropy into the peer-reviewed literature, thereby making him seem like a serious scientist, even though he gave that up decades ago. To put it mildly, he wasn't really successful, and while Fisher's fundamental theorem is scarcely known by evolutionary biologists, Even among those who do know about it, virtually none of them have ever heard of Sanford and Bassner's paper, let alone read it. It made absolutely no effect on evolutionary biology, and is only used as a feather in Sanford's cap so that he can say he is very smart.
And for decades, people worshipped him, but never actually understood what he was saying.
I'm going to need a citation for that one. But also, it is actually true that Fisher's work was widely misunderstood because he wasn't the clearest writer.
And he was ignoring his own, he glossed over something that was essential.
That sounds juicy.
And so just a few years ago, we published that paper, and it was widely read. Maybe 30,000 scientists looked at it.
Yeah, I'm going to need a citation on that, because I have never heard of anyone who isn't deeply involved in the creation-evolution discussion, even being aware that Sanford's published paper exists. And let's be clear, virtually no scientists are even aware that creationists are still a thing. Just like basically no one in the aerospace industry is really aware that flat earthers exist. Also, what did Fisher ignore?
So it's been a really interesting journey.
I guess we just don't get to know. Cool.
No doubt. By the way, you guys have to check out that paper and his other works. Dr. Sanford's works are available.
Eric takes too long just to say that you can go to logosresearchassociates.org to find the paper. I've also linked to it in the description. I would encourage you to also check out the rebuttal by Hancock and Sir Cardinal, which is also linked.
Since you're a geneticist, I got to ask you this. When it comes to the origin of life, it seems to me like there's either the divine creation account.
I find it amusing that he pretends that there is only one divine creation account when there are in fact two just in Genesis, and there are others from across the world.
There's the lightning striking the primordial soup idea that used to be taught.
A gross simplification, but okay.
And then more recently, there's the panspermia, or aliens seeded life on planet Earth. And so life just came from somewhere else, so we pushed the problem further away. I don't know if there's any others, but
there are as many as you can imagine, which is why there are so many different divine accounts. Because the thing that they all have in common is just that. They were imagined by people who didn't know the first thing about biology, except that if you stopped breathing or lost too much blood, you die. That's why God in one account commands the waters and land to bring forth living things, but in another, he breathes life directly into Adam. And in one Egyptian account, a god drops semen onto the ground, bringing forth life. Or in an Indian account, life is essentially the dream of a god. You can just keep making up creation myths. Science, though, is concerned with this little pesky thing called evidence. There is no evidence for panspermia, and there is no evidence for any divine origin of life. We do, however, have some evidence for chemical systems and pathways that might get us to life, and hence, that's where all the origin of life research is.
As a geneticist, how do you see the options when it comes to the origin of life on Earth?
Well, given that he's a former geneticist who abandoned caring about reality or evidence for emotional reasons, I'll bet he'll choose the option that makes him feel the most warm and fuzzy feelings. Which I bet is that it's a direct miracle by God who loves him for his abandonment of reality, and given that he's a Christian, I'll bet he'll go with something that looks a whole lot like the creation account in Genesis 1, but that ignores that it contradicts the account in Genesis 2.
So if people more and more people actually understand that life is unbelievably intricate.
Or maybe he'll just start waffling on. Odd choice, but hey, it's his choice to make.
It's information systems on top of information systems on top of information systems.
Ah yes, information, a word that is right up there with kind in terms of words creationists love to use, but hate to define in any useful way.
It's like an operating system, but as Bill Gates says...
I don't give a f*** what Bill Gates says about genetics. He's even less qualified than Sanford on the topics, and no, genetics is not like an operating system. That's why geneticists don't learn how to make operating systems, and why software developers don't study genetics to write operating systems.
It's just totally clear that life cannot arise spontaneously.
Pro tip to creationists out there. An argument from incredulity combined with a random quote from someone who has no training in the field isn't really a good argument. There's no reason complexity on its own is a barrier to evolution or abiogenesis, and even if current life is too complex to form spontaneously, current life is not what the first life was. So that still wouldn't matter.
And to kickstart life, you need so many miracles to happen all at the same time, same place, same moment.
Weird how no origins of life researchers seem to agree, and I now wonder if he will give any examples of such miracles, because if he doesn't, then he actually hasn't made an argument, just an assertion.
And so it's laughable, except people keep sweeping it under the rug. There are more and more actually evolutionists who are acknowledging this could only be by design. I can't see how this could arise just by trial and error.
Such as whom? The only biologists I see doing this are the creationists, and they're a dwindling lot who have yet to make a single contribution to science on the basis of their creationist ideas. Although, admittedly, some have made contributions unrelated to creationism, Sanford being one of them. Creationists love this idea that scientists are abandoning science to join them in delusion, but they're always vague on who is doing it, or what the numbers are. It's like flat earthers who declare that people are waking up and becoming flurfs in big numbers, all while interest in their insanity declines as they're continuously and very publicly humiliated. Just as an example, creationists tried to get a huge list of so-called evolution skeptics by asking numerous people to sign an ambiguously worded statement, many of whom weren't even scientists in relevant fields, and then promoted the list as a list of scientists rejecting evolution, which it never was. Then, when many of the signatories got wind of the scheme, they asked for their names to be removed, only for their names to remain. Meanwhile, Project Steve, a similar project asking only scientists in relevant fields and only those named Steve or something etymologically related, such as Stephanie, to sign, quickly has amassed far more signatures. Of course, all of this ignores that if Sanford weren't lying about this, it would just be an argumentum ad populum, and one based on a minority anyway.
Had to be divinely created, which is exactly what this says. I love it. A scientist's opinion, you got it right there, guys. Go no further.
First, I did not cut off the first part of Eric's sentence. He just started with the predicate and no subject. Second, that's not the opinion of a scientist, and even when he was a scientist, it wasn't in the field of origin of life, meaning that his opinion, even if he were still a scientist, would be pretty useless. It would be like asking an HVAC company to fix your car on the grounds that they're mechanics.
Do genetics. You wrote the book Genetic Entropy, showing that we are going downhill.
No, he wrote the book Genetic Entropy, claiming that humans are going downhill. But the first hint that that's not what he did is just how the book was published. It was published by Back to Genesis, not, a scientific publishing house. That means it was not intended to be read by anyone who knows what they're talking about when it comes to genetics. Further, the actual text is also obviously not intended for anyone who actually knows about genetics. Of course, even worse, the idea of genetic entropy does not work mathematically, as was shown in the actually peer-reviewed paper by Hancock and Stern-Cardinal, already referenced. Because it's mathematically incoherent, but also it simply does not match observation. Both in the lab and in the wild, we have seen sustained fitness gains in populations contra the predictions of genetic entropy. Genetic entropy is not an attempt at science. It's an attempt at apologetics, that is, an attempt to keep those who already believe Sanford's anti-science version of Christianity in the fold. Of course, his version of Christianity is not the only one, and many forms of Christianity do not require the denial of basic facts about reality, like common ancestry and descent with modification. Above is a link to the literature review by both Hancock and Stern-Cardinal, in case you'd rather watch that than read their paper.
But if you actually go backwards, I want to know, does this really show us a divine origin account with Adam and Eve? Can we see that in every single one of our cells? Is that what this is pointing us to?
No. It's a flat no. Nothing in genetics supports the existence of a single pair of humans who mated together to produce all future humans, and especially not so recently as 6,000 years ago.
Can you take us on that journey?
Yes, and actually we're going to talk about that.
We're like 10 minutes into this talk, John. The time to say what you will say has passed. Just say what your claims and arguments are.
So we're talking about layer and layer of information. There's also layer upon layer of evidence, and that's really exciting.
There are multiple layers of evidence, from genetics to morphology to the fossil record, all pointing towards one conclusion. Humans are apes who evolved from a common ancestor with the members of genus Pan some 6 or 7 million years ago.
And so what we learn is that the Bible is, in fact, a reliable historical resource and has science in it.
You serious?
Oh, how surprising. John thinks the evidence supports the position he got to without evidence in the first place. Fun.
In fact, we're going to show that the that patriarchs were living to be, in the 900s.
First, let's get to the point of the evidence for Adam and Eve. Second, I'm not aware of any work by Sanford on the great age of the biblical patriarchs, but hey, I haven't read everything he's ever written.
Which makes perfect sense if you realize that this was shortly after the fall and mutations had not yet been accumulating.
Oh, so it's just genetic entropy. Right.
And so those first patriarchs were, it seems ridiculous until we realize what we're saying. Of course, they were 100 years old. If they hadn't been a fall, they'd still be alive today.
Here's the reason that actually sounds ridiculous. First, since genetic entropy is mathematically impossible, there's no particular reason to talk about it as the cause of the incredible lifespans of the biblical patriarchs. Second, what possible changes to the genetics of humans could allow people, especially people living before basic things like medical science or even soap, to live so long? Just hand-waving at genetics being bad now but good in the past doesn't really answer the question. What specific parts of the genome have degraded in what way that have shortened human lifespans? If there's no answer to this, then genetic entropy, even if it weren't mathematically impossible, isn't an explanation. It's like blaming a plane crash on the wind. Unless you can say how the wind actually caused the plane crash, then just saying the wind doesn't actually explain anything. Especially if your version of how wind works has been experimentally and mathematically invalidated.
So that's, we're going to see that.
Pro tip, you're allowed to finish sentences.
Not only does that curve show that the patriarchs underwent what's called a biological decay curve, where everything is sloping downward in a curve, more moving toward extinction.
What curve? Has Eric's editor failed to show a graphic that creation today was provided or something? I don't think this one is on Sanford. I think it's on Hovind and his team. I suspect there is a curve we're just not seeing because they forgot to put it on screen.
Not only is that true, but we can, like you said, look backwards. Because if mutations are accumulating and you look backwards, there had to be some point where there were no mutations.
Nope, unless we're talking about the very first life form with a genetic code. You see, if we trace all human genetic variation back to its coalescent point, the point where humans have a single ancestral genetic code for that region of the genome, we find that different regions of the genome actually have different coalescence times. Which means that as far back as we can go, there was always variation in the human genome. And even if we go back to the longest ago coalescent ancestor for any part of the human genome, something which, as far as I know, has not been identified, but which must logically exist, there is no reason that that genome is particularly special, and it also exists in a population with genetic diversity, which we can tell because we can also extend coalescence outside of just Homo sapiens, something which on its own tosses special creation off the boat and into the waters of stupid bullshit that opposes reality. Until we get to the very first genetic code ever, all genetic diversity is caused by mutations, so you cannot meaningfully say that organisms in the past had fewer mutations. They were all mutations. Now, a special creation believer might counter that the first genetic codes were actually specially created by God and had no mutations, since they did not have ancestral genomes from which to mutate. And that's all well and good, except that, at least for young Earth creationists, we can't find a coalescence time that fits within their timeline for the Earth's existence. And to be fair to them, since they expect that kinds were created with adult members with no ancestry, we should prefer the time to the most recent 4 alleles, a concept pioneered by theistic evolutionist and Christian biologist Joshua Swamidass. Of course, the problem is that when he ran the numbers on this, it still violates the young Earth timeline, and also failed to support a human population bottleneck of 2 at any point in the past. Okay, let's move on because I feel like I'm rambling.
And that's what takes us right back to Adam and Eve.
Mathematically impossible and incredibly stupid genetics from a man who uses emotions rather than evidence to judge the truth of propositions is what takes us back to Adam and Eve? I mean, yeah, that checks out. It's not like it was going to be science, since there never were 2 original unspoiled perfect humans. Also, you might be aware that creationists and intelligent design proponents, and even C-design proponentsists, are all supporting the charge of the far right and even ethno-nationalism. Do you think it's a coincidence that Sanford believes in an original genetically pure human genome that has been lost to corruption? Sure sounds a lot like racial purity ideology, and while I don't think that's an idea that Sanford would accept, he sure isn't doing anything to hinder that idea, and his work could easily be used to support it.
No mutations until the fall.
That implies that there were perfect mechanisms of DNA replication and repair. But that raises a question. The reason organisms don't have perfect mechanisms for DNA repair is not primarily because it's impossible. It's not clear that it is impossible. But rather, it's that it's costly. We can see this fact demonstrated by the existence of mutational hotspots. Perhaps the most famous example of such hotspots was found in Arabidopsis thaliana, a small plant native to Eurasia and North Africa, but that has been introduced to much of the rest of the world, including most of North America, parts of South America, East Africa, and Australia. Some parts of its genome have much higher rates of mutation than other parts. While obviously it is more complicated than this, in general, those parts of the genome that are involved in vital and very sequence-dependent functions tend to have slower mutation rates, and those that are not functional have higher mutation rates. This protects the organism from an abundance of harmful mutations. But why not have the low mutation rates across the whole genome? Well, because error correction mechanisms are metabolically costly, and if you don't need them, then the organism is better off not bothering with them. So did Adam and Eve just spend way more energy on cell division? Did they not need cell division before the fall? If so, does that mean that Eve didn't menstruate, and that Adam and Eve couldn't grow hair or fingernails, or repair damage to their skin? Does that apply to all organisms? Saying there were no mutations before the fall sounds great, but when you actually dig into what that would really mean, you quickly realize it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
I begin this with this title, Good Science Affirms Scripture.
Now, let's remember what he actually means by that title. He does not mean that when you do good science, you find that the Bible is true. Rather, he means by that you can judge science as being good or bad based on whether it confirms your particular interpretation of the Bible. I'm sure Sanford himself would think those two different meanings are essentially the same, but they're not.
And for the last 20-some years that I've been a creationist scientist.
Okay, I'm going to choose my words very carefully. It is not impossible to be a creationist who is also an actual scientist. Similarly, it is not impossible to think that the Earth is flat or that vaccines cause autism and be a scientist. But in all three cases, it's going to be very tough to do. Virtually every field of science contradicts young Earth creationism in some way, just like it does flat Earth, although I suppose this is less the case for vaccine denialism. On the other hand, as near as I can tell, Sanford has never been a creationist and a scientist at the same time. He certainly is not one now.
I've discovered, and my colleagues like Rob Carter and so many other scientists.
Rob Carter is also not a scientist. He is a pseudoscientist. They are not the same thing. Rob Carter is a scientist the way Benedict Cumberbatch is a detective or a sorcerer.
Is that we believe this is true. Good science affirms Scripture.
I'm sure that they do believe that, and it is evidence that they are not scientists. Not a result of them being scientists. But again, this is not a statement that science, when done well, supports the Bible, since it generally does not, but it is instead a claim that the only things they are willing to count as good science is that which affirms the Bible, which ironically enough often corresponds to science that is done poorly, sometimes fraudulently, and which often ignores most of the relevant data.
It makes a great title for a book, and in the meantime, I encourage everyone to think along these lines. There is bad science that promotes evolution, but
Ah yes, the science that all the scientists do is mean poopy-head science. That's how we get to conclusions that make Sanford feel bad, like universal common ancestry, the reality and cause of climate change, and that his mommy was wrong to love him.
the good science continuously affirms Scripture. So Adam and Eve have been, trashed for hundreds of years, not thousands of years, but a few hundred years.
Have they? Their existence, being obviously not literally true, has been denied by basically everyone who cares about evidence or reality for that long, but that's not the same thing as trashing them. Just saying that someone didn't exist isn't trashing them. I don't sit around trashing Captain James T. Kirk or James R. Kirk, because they're fictional. Similarly, I don't think I've ever really trashed Adam or Eve. I'm not sure what the point would be. I suppose I am now trashing someone who thinks they were real historical characters, despite the fact that he knows better. But that's because he's an intellectually dishonest idiot who's playing backup for people who would see my friend's existence made illegal, and who would remove what few effective public health measures the United States has.
And now science, good science, is restoring Adam and Eve.
And I'm beginning to think we won't even get to any of that science in this episode. Oh well, I suppose that's why I'll make another one, perhaps even one after that.
Okay, so this work was in close connection with Dr. Robert Carter, who's an awesome geneticist in his own right.
Not how I'd describe him.
So I give him most of the credit. I'm more of a cheerleader than a lab scientist.
Hey, props to Sanford for having a modicum of self-awareness. That's more than I can say for most creationists.
So he has worked with me with my little foundation, Feed My Sheep Foundation.
Yes, a name that just screams scientific rigor.
And so he contributed to this PowerPoint, this work, and also Dr. Wes Brewer, who's a world expert in numerical simulation, which is a way of analyzing complex things. Dr. John Baumgartner, which is...
I know Baumgartner primarily for his simulations of catastrophic plate tectonics that required him to increase the thermal diffusivity of the Earth's crust by a factor of about 1,000.
One of the top creation scientists in the world.
I feel like if you just decide that reality is inconvenient by like 3 orders of magnitude, that makes you a top scientist in creation land. No wonder no one in any scientific field takes them seriously, and their ideas just fail to gain traction. They're wrong before they even analyze them.
Dr. Franzine Smith, who has helped me for years on our work, and others. So I really believe in teams, and we had a great team for this particular line of research.
Wow, 15 minutes in, and we still haven't actually gotten to the point. But at least it gave me an excuse to talk about why creationism isn't science, and why creationists generally are not scientists.
There are new attacks against Adam and Eve, even while we're discovering evidence that show that Adam and Eve are real people.
That's weird, because those authors are trying to salvage the idea of Adam and Eve. They realize that the evidence is conclusive that the population of Homo sapiens was never 2, especially not within the time frame that young Earth creationism demands. So they are coming up with options for a historical Adam and Eve that are at least possible given what we know about reality, in that they were real people who are ancestral to all living humans, but who were not the first or only humans, just the first ones who made a covenant with God.
The Biologos group remains hostile to creation, and so they're Christian, I think.
They are indeed Christian, and they are only hostile to creation if you define it narrowly. They believe that the God of the universe created the universe and did so in a way to meet his intention that humans exist, and then entered into a covenant with them. Basically, they are just attempting to make the story of Adam and Eve at least possible. That's basically the opposite of the attack that Sanford is accusing them of. Personally, I don't think that Christianity requires a belief in a historical Adam and Eve, but then, I'm not a theologian or a Christian clergyman, so it's not like I have any authority on the matter.
But they don't seem to be prepared to believe and obey the Lord on some of these issues.
No, that's exactly what they're trying to do. It's just that they can't bring themselves to do it the easy way and reject reality in doing so. But this brings up some things about Christian theology that I do think are actually relevant. Those things being the perspicuity of Scripture and biblical inerrancy. The first, perspicuity, is the idea that the important meaning of the Scriptures is clear and obvious enough that anyone reading them with a decent translation can come to the correct understanding of Christian theology. Or at least, they will be able to do so when helped by the Holy Spirit, who is guiding all Christians. This is clearly false because of the myriad versions of especially Protestant Christianity with mutually incompatible beliefs about what the true Christian theology is, based on the Bible. The second, biblical inerrancy, is obviously false simply because the Bible contradicts itself, so it must have errors for that simple reason alone. But further, because it is false, it means that the Bible on its own cannot validate any belief, even a theological one. This is why, historically, Christianity was not based on the Bible alone, or sola scriptura, in the language of the Protestant Reformation. But since Hovind and Sanford's Christianity is, they run into these problems. They reject reality and accuse other, just as sincere Christians of attacking Christianity or the Bible. In addition to those two having rejected the importance of reality and evidence, I would submit that their theological thinking is self-defeating.
So these are just three scientists who have kind of abandoned ship.
Venema and Swamidass are, as far as I know, scientists, but I don't know in what universe Craig would be a scientist. Even by the warped standards of young Earth creationism. He doesn't even pretend to be a scientist like Sanford does. He's a philosopher and apologist. His own website for his own ministry describes him thusly, quote, William Lane Craig is visiting scholar of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology and professor of philosophy at Houston Christian University, end quote. So he doesn't even self-identify as a scientist as near as I can tell. He's just willing to, at least on this front, accept a theological possibility that isn't rendered impossible by the facts on the ground here in physical reality.
William Craig, especially, was really well known as an ID proponent and a Christian, but now he is rejected. He's bought into full-blown.
For f***'s sake, Sanford could articulate, but no. Apparently, Craig is bought into evsofarn, or whatever. I'm assuming that what he was trying to say is evolution and so forth, but I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think he said. And other than turning the volume up, I have not edited this audio in any way. Also, weren't we supposed to get some evidence or arguments for the historical Adam and Eve? Why are we just complaining about people who wrote books doing just that, albeit in a way Johnny here doesn't like?
Evolutionists. It's really sad to see really smart people get so smart that they think they're smarter than God, and that's sad.
Yeah, instead they should have had failing marriages that got fixed because they went to church and then realized that reality doesn't matter if church can fix a marriage. Then they'd be right on board with Sanford.
So, what's at stake? Why are we talking about Adam and Eve? I mean, maybe they lived in the past, maybe they didn't, who knows?
Oh, most people know. It's not really a hard question to answer whether or not Adam and Eve existed at any time in the past as the first and only two humans. The answer is no.
What does it matter? Number one, is God good?
I'm not sure how we're supposed to get to the answer Sanford would prefer from accepting the historicity of the Genesis 2 account, since in that one God seems to lie to Adam and Eve and restrict them from knowledge for no clear reason. If we're going to take that literally, then it would seem that God is at least a mixed bag when it comes to good and evil. I guess that's another reason a Christian might not want to take Genesis too literally.
If God is good, then why is there evil in death?
That is not a problem that can be solved with the Adam and Eve story. In fact, if you take a look at the Adam and Eve story and combine it with Job, the actual book of the Bible dedicated to answering the question of the problem of evil, the answer is that sometimes God is a dick. So, he's not good if we take the Bible literally. That solves the problem of evil rather neatly, of course at the expense of some core beliefs about God that most Christians have, but even if we don't go that route and say that evil is the result of Adam and Eve's sin, there is nothing that would prevent God from making an Adam and Eve 2.0 and sterilizing Adam and Eve OG edition, or simply not allowing evil to persist. The fact is that the problem of evil is still a problem even if you trace the evil to the fall in the garden. I'm not saying that there can't be a theodicy that solves the problem of evil, just that Adam and Eve ain't it.
These are profound, these are not tangential Christian concerns. These are foundational.
Sure, I don't see how a historical Adam and Eve help. If anything, I would say that a historical Adam and Eve make these problems worse.
Is Scripture trustworthy?
For historical data? Absolutely not. Major events in the Christian Bible just didn't happen, like the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, the census in Luke, and the slaughter of the innocents just did not happen.
People who are rejecting Scripture right from the get-go in the Bible, how are they going to trust the other parts of the Bible? How are they going to believe in the return of Christ?
I don't know, and I don't care. That's a problem for someone else. Is this whole thing going to be yet more non-evidential reasons that Sanford thinks Adam and Eve are historical? Are we going to go the majority of this whole thing without John even trying? It's starting to look that way.
So, are we special? Are we just really clever chimpanzees?
Being special and being related to chimpanzees are not mutually exclusive. And it's honestly baffling to me why he thinks they are, or at least talks like they are.
Or we made in the image of God.
Well, if you want to take the idea of the image of God literally, as humans look like what God looks like, then God is an ape, and that's kind of weird. You could go the more traditional Christian route and say that the Imago Dei is about things like rational, ethical, and creative capacity, in which case it doesn't really matter if humans evolved from chimps or not. And the thing is, I think that Sanford probably does take it that way, but also finds it a useful cudgel against the science he rejects, despite the fact that his use of it that way does not really correspond to what I suspect are his conscious beliefs about it. Then again, I could be completely wrong. I'm not a mind reader.
These are incredibly important. I heard someone say to me the other day, well, creation's just a side issue. Maybe not a primary or secondary, it's a third level. No, people lose their faith over and over and over again because they read Genesis and they're told there's no way that can be true. It's all just stupid lies.
Anecdotally, I know far more people who lost their faith because they were lied to by people like Sanford and Hovind than who did so because they accepted science. In fact, most Christians belong to denominations or churches that do not require the rejection of evolution or the age of the earth.
So it's hugely important. The reason for the cross, if there hadn't been a fall, if there hadn't been Adam and Eve, there wouldn't have been a need for a cross.
Once again, numerous Christian groups managed to not find this to be a problem.
So this is fundamental.
Fundamentally non-evidentiary. Honestly, it is staggering to me the degree to which Sanford does not care about evidence when faced with a theological conundrum. I find that a confusing stance. The Bible is a contingent thing. It depends on physical reality to exist. Why should I take it more seriously than the evidence of physics, chemistry, paleontology, history, archaeology, and genetics, as Sanford does? Those are all studying things that are prior to the Bible, and on which the Bible depends for its existence. Now don't get me wrong, I rather like the Bible. I think it's an interesting read, and even more interesting when you actually dig into the history and scholarship around it. But the idea that it can overrule reality seems just crazy on its face to me.
And then lastly, a lot of people, because they don't believe Genesis, they don't believe Revelation, and they reject heaven. It's incredibly important that we believe the reality of heaven.
I don't think that follows, but whatever. I guess we're finally getting to the evidence.
So 3 types of evidence we're going to talk about in terms of affirming literal Adam and Eve: Scripture, history, and genetics.
So 2 types of evidence. Scripture is making the claim. It's not the evidence. If I told you that I'm actually the arbiter of the afterlife, and that for that reason you must contribute to my Patreon, because only those who do so will be in paradise, and their place in paradise is determined by how much they give me over their lifetime, you might want evidence of this before you decide to hand over your life savings to my Patreon account. And me, just pointing out that I said it was the case, probably wouldn't be very convincing. The Bible, in a few places, seems to make the claim that Adam and Eve were real. Okay, that's why it's something we might want evidence for. But it in itself is not evidence for anything, except what the Bible says.
First 2 briefly, and the third one, we're going to delve into the genetics. So let's just start out with evidence from Scripture.
Fine.
This Genesis and creation and the fall and the flood and all those things are pivotal, and there's evidence for them.
It's completely irrelevant how pivotal they are. The problem is that if we're testing to see if part of the Bible is true, which is the whole point of this, then we don't get to assume the importance or truth of the Bible to do it. Genesis 1 through 11 could be the absolutely most important text of all texts in Christianity, second not even to the 4 Gospels. That wouldn't give us a single reason to accept that Adam and Eve were real.
And so, for example, in the New Testament authors extensively quote Genesis as history, especially Genesis 1 through 11. So,
So people in the past thought it was true. Well, people in the past used to think that there was a dome over the earth and the earth was flat. In fact, that's in Genesis 1. People used to think that fire was phlogiston, or as I've heard one Catzoid call it, plastogen, escaping from an object. People used to think that infectious diseases were spread by foul odors. People used to think that heavy things fell faster than light things. People used to think that the earth was the center of the universe, or that American democracy was permanent. All of these things are wrong, despite the fact that even very well-educated and intelligent humans used to believe them. The fact that the biblical authors accepted the historicity of parts of what they considered scripture is not evidence that those things are true.
This is foundational, and it's and there's huge geological evidence for a global flood.
I would love to see any evidence for a global flood, because instead what I actually see is that basically every feature of the Earth's geology absolutely precludes a global flood as believed in by young Earthers. There are literal mountains of evidence against this idea. At the most basic, the flood can't account for non-waterborne sedimentary rocks like Aeolian sandstone, subaerial tuff, or evaporite deposits like the pink salt of the Himalayas. But even among the rocks that are deposited by water, many of them could not have been deposited in a flood some few thousand years ago and then have lithified in that time. A prime example being limestone. Further, there are rocks with tidal interbedding, something that can only form with slow deposition affected by tides, and which show decades of uninterrupted tidal deposition. There are lake deposits, which themselves are a problem, but which show centuries of seasonal deposition in the form of varves. Anyone who tells you that there was a global flood is either very stupid, lying, or is profoundly uneducated. Since it is hard to imagine that Dr. Sanford, a once respected geneticist, is either stupid or uneducated, I am forced to conclude that he is lying. I welcome anyone who disagrees with that assessment, which is only my opinion, to show me evidence that he is instead uneducated or stupid. If you think you can show that he is either of those, feel free to let me know in the comments and provide why you think that.
There's a huge evidence for the fall, which is all the evil in the world.
No, the fall is an ideology for evil, or at least that's the more likely possibility than that it is historical. There are ideologies all over the world for things like why bad things happen, why animals are the way they are, why people are the way they are, how the world got here. Sanford has a favorite ideology, but if he wants to show that his favorite is actually the one with history behind it, he has to do a lot more than just point out that the thing the ideology was created to explain exists. If that's evidence of the truth of the Bible, is the existence of the world proof that the Egyptian god Atum exists and masturbated the world into existence? I don't think it is, and I suspect that neither would Sanford. So we need to have a good reason to think that the ideology he likes is special, beyond simply that it's popularly believed, because that is just an argumentum ad populum.
They specifically speak of the fall of the serpent, Adam, Eve. These are all mentioned by New Testament authors.
In a shocking twist of events, authors writing as part of one of the religious groups that sprang from Second Temple Judaism cite religious texts that were important to Second Temple Jews. This is an amazing revelation that still does nothing to actually give us evidence for Adam and Eve, which, as a reminder, is supposed to be the whole point of this talk. And now we're well into a second episode, and that hasn't even been attempted. Although, to be fair, we've gotten a fascinating look at how it is that a smart person starts to believe such incredibly stupid things as that the Earth is flat or young. It's all about emotional reasoning and in-group bias, it seems.
They speak of the fall of the serpent, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth, Enoch, the flood, and Noah. So obviously the New Testament authors, including the ones that are in red, so these are things coming out of the mouth of Jesus Christ.
Well, according to the authors of the Gospels, but those texts are far too late to be first-hand accounts. So really, these are things that the Gospel writers either made up or were reported to them. We don't really have any terrific way to know exactly what Jesus said, although it does seem plausible that he said things much like what are recorded in the Gospels. I don't think the few decades between the death of Jesus and the authoring of the Gospels would be enough to completely obscure all of his teachings among those who were part of the movement that would become Christianity as we know it today. Further, a lot of the things we have in the Gospels are compatible with first century Jewish apocalypticism, which seems a very plausible thing for Jesus to have interacted with or been a part of. So I'd say that while we can't rely on the Gospels to quote Jesus accurately, we can probably say that the gist of his message is at least somewhat accurately recorded in at least the Synoptic Gospels. Although, even then, we should take things with a grain of salt when it comes to treating them as historical records. But also, even if Jesus was accurately reported to have said things about Genesis, that does not make them true. He also is reported to have said that the mustard seed is the smallest seed. It's not. And while I don't think this is some big gotcha for Christianity, it establishes that not everything Jesus is reported to have said in the Gospels is literally true. Which means anything he said about history needs to be investigated, even if you're a Christian who is committed to the historicity of the Gospels.
Obviously, this is very, very important, and the New Testament people were very, very aware of Genesis, and they believed it was true.
I'm not really sure we can say that for certain from just the New Testament texts. People often talk about well-known stories without pointing out that they are not true, because it is commonly known what the story is, and it is commonly known that the story is not true. For example, if I talk to someone about the Battle of Wolf 359 from Star Trek, I am not likely to point out that it's not true. So I don't think that on its own the reference to Genesis is very good evidence that the authors believed that the stories were actually true. Although, they very possibly did. I just don't find this argument very compelling. And of course, even if they did believe these things, that does not provide evidence for the actual historicity of Genesis 1 or 2. This is just an argument from authority. Now, at the risk of committing the fallacy, The fact that so far Sanford is relying on fallacious arguments is not reason to think that his conclusion is false. It's just that so far, he has not given us a reason to think it is true.
There are twice as many references to Adam and Eve in the New Testament than in the Old Testament. So if you're really going to be a Christian, you have to embrace the whole story and trust God from beginning to end.
And here we see that this entire apologetics endeavor is not aimed at getting non-Christian reasons to join up. It's about keeping Christians in.
There's two supposed creation conflicts in chapter 2, between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis. The bottom line is, if you look at it carefully, it's very clear that chapter 1 was about how God created all kinds of plants. And the term that was used was Elohim, which is an expansive view of God Almighty. And then chapter 2 was about Yahweh. So he's now talking about the Lord over us, a personal relationship with the Lord.
I'm not aware of any good reason to think that the different titles used for God in Genesis refer to God in relation to different parts of the world. This seems like it was just made up to help overcome the very obvious contradictions between the two creation accounts in Genesis.
And we see that in the 6th day of chapter 2, it says that there was no suitable garden yet for Adam.
Okay, so this is Genesis 2, 4b through 9, from the Revised Standard Version Updated Edition.
In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no vegetation of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground, but a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole of the face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Here we have a one-day creation with humans being made before there were plants anywhere. Sanford is just lying about the Bible in a desperate and pathetic attempt to pretend that it has no contradictions. It's already bad enough that he has to mislead people about science because he converted to this particular branch of Christianity to save his marriage. But lying about the Bible seems even worse, since I think that would be blasphemous according to him. Again, I'm willing to entertain arguments that he is simply stupid or ignorant if anyone feels like I'm being too harsh with the accusation of dishonesty.
So God planted a special garden for them, for domestic plants and animals. So there's a big difference between the day 3, when all types of plants were created, and the garden that was specifically made for Adam and his family.
That would be cool, if the text of Genesis 2 didn't directly contradict the very notion of a 6-day creation with plants coming before Adam. But hey, it's just the book that Sanford thinks is not only our guide to the universe, but also eternal life. I'm sure it's not important to be honest or informed about it.
So this is a slide that some of you have seen, I hope, and it's stunning because it's data drawn directly from the Bible.
I feel like I know what's coming, and that it's p-hacked. Let's find out, though.
So some of you probably wonder why on earth these genealogies matter.
I don't.
And they matter because they're history.
No, the best case for Sanford is that they're historiography, because they were not written anywhere near the time they're about. But there's no reason to think they're even that. They're made up.
And what we see is that the history shows that that mankind is not evolving.
Well, history only goes back about 5,500 to 6,000 years at maximum, because history is the study of the events, changes, and continuities of the past as seen through the lens of the writings of the people who lived at the time under investigation. So before writing, there was no history in the academic sense. There are places in the world that still do not technically have a history because the people there do not have a writing system. That does not mean those people have no past, that their stories about their own past have no truth to them, or that their past is unimportant. It just means that it's not written down, and so it falls under different disciplines. Now, there is some debate about the degree to which oral history counts, and I would say that it does count as long as it is recorded and set down from accounts of those who lived the events they are describing. Traditional oral histories, I would not say are history proper, although they are certainly a way to learn about the past, and are not less valuable for not meeting some academic definition for what is history in the strict sense. But anyway, that was a bit of a tangent. In the maximum time span of history, we should not expect to see much in the way of biological evolution. That's not really a long time. Only 3% of the time the species Homo sapiens has existed, if I'm being generous. Saying that history does not show us evolution is like glancing at an oak tree for 30 seconds and then concluding that you have no reason to think oak trees grow.
We're evolving in the sense we have more technology and we have better nutrition.
Yeah, that's cultural evolution, something which exploded over the course of history, in part because of writing itself.
But basically, apart from those artificial conditions, mankind is declining rapidly due to accumulation of mutations. Every generation is more mutant than the last one.
How cool would it be if he bothered to actually provide evidence for that? Oh, wait. That's sort of the whole point of his book, Genetic Entropy. And that thing is so dense with stupidity and obvious falsehoods that the Romulans want to use it to power their warp drive.
You are more mutant than your parents, and your children are going to be more mutant than you. Sorry to tell you that.
No apology needed, since it's literally meaningless to say that one organism is more mutant than another. The very fact that different parts of the genome have different coalescence times is more than enough reason to conclude that everyone is basically completely mutant, and all extant genetic diversity arose from mutation, meaning you can't become more mutant. Your genome is already 100% mutations, so having it mutate again still leaves it at 100% mutations.
But that is the reality. We are all dying.
Yes, we are all dying, but that's not exactly new, and is primarily because of senescence, not in most cases because of mutations, although obviously there are exceptions. Also, weren't we supposed to see a curve of some kind? Where's the curve?
So Noah lived to be 950 years old.
Ask, and ye shall receive.
The first 9 patriarchs before him were about the same age.
Just on this chart, we have 930, 912, 905, 910, 895, 962, 365, and 777 years of age at death. I would not consider that to be all about the same age, especially not with Lamech living to only 777 years and Enoch only 365 years. You want to guess why he did not include them in his chart? It's because they throw off the amazing mathematical fit that his chart has. A fit that, I happen to know from previous investigation, is in fact a scam. Sanford cherry-picked the numbers to get him the best fit. He's lying about this data, and there's no way for him not to be. If he were simply ignorant or stupid, he couldn't have managed to get this chart. To make this scam of a chart, you have to be knowledgeable about statistics and arrange the data in such a way that they look highly statistically significant. You can't do that if you're stupid or ignorant.
That's pretty interesting. Noah lived to be 950. Did something special happen when with Noah?
Until we have good reason to think he even existed, it's kind of like asking if something special happened to Sheev Palpatine. I mean, he did return somehow, so presumably the answer is yes. I'm just not sure how it's supposed to matter to real life. One group of people that would never ruin a multi-billion-dollar franchise with worse writing than a fanfic penned by a 13-year-old are my patrons and channel members. If you're enjoying the video, why not hit like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description. It starts at just $1 a month. You can get a 15% discount for pledging annually. Also, you can join the channel for access to special channel emojis. Both Patreon and channel memberships give you access to my super secret Discord server, as well as early access to videos like this, sometimes many months in advance.
Well, let's see. That was a small thing called the flood.
Ah, yes, the thing that's physically impossible as described. Also, remember, this is supposed to be about Adam and Eve, and so far Sanford has still not even tried to argue for their existence, apart from pretending that the Bible doesn't contradict itself in the first few chapters.
And so Noah lived to be 950. And so let's look at the axes. On the left, we see lifespans in years. And on the bottom, we have generations since Noah. So we can draw a curve based upon data points using this graph.
You might be thinking, gee, that's a small number of data points if we're drawing the ages at death that we know from the Bible. And you'd be right, it is. But it's far worse than that, because that's not all that's on there.
Okay, so Noah, 950, Shem, 600, poor guy, only lived to be 600. Abraham, I'm highlighting, you can see that all the dots are different people, right?
Once again, no one has a lower opinion of the intelligence and level of education of the average lay creationist than do young earth creationist speakers.
And you can see that some of the dots I'm putting in red because they're key players in the Bible. So Abraham lives to be 175, and then Moses lives to be 120, And then King David lives to be 70, which is average, approximately the life expectancy of today.
Actually, it's basically just a normal lifespan. Life expectancy is about how long statistically someone will live on average after being born. Lifespan is basically how long it takes for people to die of old age. Lifespan has not greatly increased since the Bronze Age. Life expectancy has. All this means is that if we take the age of David at death at face value, he lived a fairly normal length life for someone who died of old age.
And then in the time of Jesus, the average life expectancy, including wars and disease, was about 45 years. So
weird how that's not from the Bible. It's because the biblical ages on their own don't give a good fit. So this was tossed in at the end because a single convenient data point at the tail end of the graph can really increase the fit of the curve. Further, since this is supposed to be about lifespan, how long people live until they die of old age, it's a blatantly dishonest data point to add, because lifespan in the Roman Empire was well into the 70s or 80s.
This curve is stunning because it shows that not only is there a decline in longevity, that it's very, very scientifically laid out. And this is not written by a person. This is written by different people in the Bible.
Yeah, and then cherry-picked to Hellenbeck by two people, Sanford and his little buddy in fraudulence, Christopher Roop. The guy one Sal Cordova threw under the bus, saying that he was the one who lied to Sanford about the origin of species not having any math and being in part in German. Of course, that just means Sanford is a credulous idiot who is willing to state things as fact without doing even the smallest bit of verification. So I'm not sure why Sal thought that was actually a defense. But further, this isn't the first time I've gone over this chart. It was previously used on the channel by Dan Biddle, the man who thinks that the Alvarez hypothesis, which states that an asteroid hit near the modern-day Yucatan Peninsula, and was the main cause of the end Cretaceous mass extinction, is in fact stating that all dinosaurs everywhere at all times were killed directly by this asteroid, including the Triassic and the Jurassic dinosaurs, which lived tens of millions of years before the end Cretaceous. Also, he used this chart, oddly enough, with a Hovind. In this case, it was the Hovind who abused Eric Hovind as a child, both emotionally and physically, and also had a small child die on his property, only for him to just not care and use it as an excuse to hand out invitations to his deadly hole in the ground of a camp, namely, the 4 times divorced, racist, anti-Semitic, convicted spouse abuser, and tax fraudster, almost certain former lover of Steve Lynn, and yet virulently homophobic grifter whose sole purpose in life seems to be making Christianity look as stupid and backwards as humanly possible, thus chasing off the very people he's seeking to convert to his narrow-minded, faux literalist cult of disinformation and anti-knowledge, Kent Hovind. Anyway, this isn't really supposed to be about a man who never met a woman or child he wasn't willing to beat. It's about the graph. And here's my response to Dan Biddle on this very graph from like 6 months ago or something, depending on my upload schedule. Okay, so far in responding to this, I've been taking it in good faith that Dan is just presenting the numbers in the Genesis genealogy as he finds them in the Masoretic text. In fact, he presented that as a data table, and it's the data table I use to get my second-order polynomial curve of best fit with its r-squared value of 0.8787. So what's this graph then? Well, it turns out it's figure 3 from Genetic Entropy Recorded in the Bible ? By John Sanford and Christopher Roop, published near as I can tell, just on the internet, as a PDF. The data table for this has some interesting aspects. For one thing, notice that there's only one age in the graph for one generation after Noah. Turns out that's Shem. Where did Japheth and Ham go? Well, they aren't in the data, because obviously if you have 3 data points with different y values all on the exact same x value, it's going to decrease the fit value and increase your p value. Further, you might note that there's a big gap after the middle part of the graph until the next data point. That's King David. What about all the other kings with known ages? Even the ones who died of natural causes as opposed to the ones who died violently. I mean, it seems fair to exclude the murdered people, since clearly their ages at death don't reflect lifespan. But, what about the others? Oh, you see they go up and down, and so, again, decrease the closeness of the fit and increase the p-value. Then, of course, we skip down to average Roman life expectancy, which helps finish off the tail of this with a nice low value of 45. What's the problem with that? Well, life expectancy isn't the same thing as lifespan. The thing is that the lifespan is how old a member of a population will live on average, assuming that they do not die of something that can't be attributed to old age, like a sudden plague, murder, etc. The lifespan of Romans and the age of King David would be pretty much the same, again lowering the closeness of the fit and increasing the p-value. So when Dan says you can't make this up, what he really means is that anyone can make this up if they just pick numbers that work on either tail of the graph and exclude numbers that don't work so well. This is intentional p-hacking. This is manipulation of the sample in order to get a desired level of statistical significance. Sanford and Root are lying in this paper. There's no way around it. Sanford at least knows enough about statistics, being a former scientist, to know better. I want to thank Marshall Jansen of the BioLogos forums, whose post led me to the source of this graph and pointed me towards the data table for Figure 3. I don't even know who you are, Marshall, but I greatly appreciate you making my life just that much easier.
And so they're not like they fudged this. You have to go through and actually find these people, find out when they were born and when they died, to figure out how old they are. But when you do that, and we've done that, and you can do that at Logos RA. If you go to logosra.org, we have all the data, so you can look at who lived exactly when and where.
Yeah, and I'm sure they have all the data they used to construct this chart there. And I'm sure that chart that I'd construct would match. Too bad the data is in fact cherry-picked. Oops.
Point is, this is a biological decay curve. It's clearly headed down, not up.
Yeah, about that. It's headed up if you don't cherry-pick. The thing is that if you use the actual Roman lifespan as would be appropriate, for a graph of lifespan, well then it flattens out at about David and then starts to go up again somewhere around the 18th or 19th century, since lifespans have been creeping up and life expectancy has been shooting up to be very close to lifespan.
It slows down more recently. More recently, people are living a little longer.
Oh, okay, so it's not on the way down. And saying that it was just wasn't true.
Is that because this has been reversed? No. It just means that we have artificial things like pharmaceuticals and better nutrition and all those things.
Then it has been reversed. It doesn't matter why it has been. How do we know the reason that Noah lived so long wasn't super secret antediluvian superfoods and medical technology? And of course, all that just assumes that these numbers are historical and not legendary, when in fact there is no reason to suppose that, and no, a cherry-picked data table does not help with that.
So, but that's just a little bleep.
Is that some kind of human colloquialism of which I am unaware?
That's not genetic. What we're seeing here is genetic decay.
Okay, let's just pretend that this graph has any validity whatsoever and isn't just a massive fraud in a long line of massive creationist frauds. How does he know that this is genetic decay? How does he know that there weren't just more salubrious environments back in the day? Or that the patriarchs weren't rationing the last of whatever ambrosial food Noah preserved from before the flood? Or that they weren't the beneficiaries of hyper-advanced but fading medical techniques from God? Now, you might say that's not in the Bible, and that's why they know it's not that, but neither is genetic entropy in the Bible. So extra-biblical explanations are absolutely on the table. And also, let's not forget that it's not like Sanford invented genetic entropy and then only after became aware of the declining ages of the figures in the Bible. He started with that knowledge, and it's part of the reason he even came up with the idea. He is post hoc cherry-picking data in an attempt to pretend that he has evidence for his mathematically impossible nonsense.
And we'll be seeing that more. You can make this curve yourself if you want, because it's so fascinating, and you can pull it out of the Bible, and sure enough, you'll see what we're seeing here.
I wonder what book of the Bible has the Roman life expectancy and also tells you that it's okay to pretend that it's Roman lifespan. It's probably third bullshit, chapter 4, verse 20.
Notice we're using generations. It's more useful to get a better curve if you count by generations rather than by year, because people's the yearly thing gets it off kilter.
Sure, why not? I don't care.
Historical evidence. Okay, there's a lot of history here. Historically, who has believed Adam?
Let's just assume that it was every man, woman, child, dog, cat, goldfish, and parrot who ever lived until today. It doesn't matter. That's not evidence of their historicity unless we have their actual bones or their writings or something like that. We don't. But what we do have is genetics that absolutely do not line up with the idea of a historical Adam and Eve as the sole progenitors of humanity.
A lot of people think, that's just a little group of stupid Jewish people who were believing anything.
I mean, that's absolutely not how I would put it. Being wrong when there's little to no evidence and science hasn't even been invented isn't exactly a sign of being stupid. The people who wrote the Bible weren't stupid. The people through the ages who saw the various books that are now in the Bible as authoritative weren't for that reason stupid, although I suspect that some of them were, just because out of any large sample of any population, you'll get the relatively less intelligent among them.
Let's just consider who has believed in a literal Adam.
Sure, why not? It's not like we're well past the halfway point in this interview without even a single argument in favor of the historicity of Adam and Eve. Why start with arguments for it now?
Well, the ancient Jews, yes, many Orthodox Jews also. The authors of the New Testament, including Jesus, say they believe in Adam.
Jesus isn't the author of any of the New Testament, so you can't include him in a list of New Testament authors. He's not in that club. How does Sanford not know this? Does he really think that a book in the New Testament was written by Jesus? Which one? Philemon? Mark? 2 Corinthians?
Early church fathers believed in Adam.
And geocentrism.
The Catholic Church and all the popes still agree that they believe in Adam.
They also think condoms are a bad thing and are thereby hindering public health efforts. So, also not exactly the best source. Plus, Sanford is a Protestant. A core part of that is not caring what the Pope thinks. So why does he care what they think?
The Protestant Church, Luther, Calvin, and all those guys, they all believed in Adam.
Well, they also believed in sola scriptura, which isn't even logically coherent, so again, not impressed.
The greatest evangelists believed in Adam. Today, most of Bible-believing Christians still believe in Adam.
Most believing Christians believing in an obviously wrong thing isn't really a flex.
And interestingly, most Orthodox Muslims believe in Adam.
Is that interesting? I mean, Adam and his wife are in the Quran. Eve isn't named, because the only named woman in the Quran is Mary, although the text seems to think that she's the mother of Jesus and also the sister of Moses, because the author of the Quran clearly had only a rudimentary familiarity with biblical texts. But yeah, it's no surprise that Muslims believe in the people talked about in the Quran. They also believe in Jesus, Moses, Abraham, etc. Has John ever read the Quran? It's not that long, although the second surah is a slog, so I can see why some people might get bogged down there.
That's kind of interesting.
Not really. Muhammad portrays himself as the last in a line of prophets that include Jesus as well as most of the important biblical figures, including Noah and Adam. He was trying to integrate himself with Jewish and Christian communities in Arabia. He kind of failed at that, but clearly most of his theology was a rehash of Christian, Jewish, and possibly Mandaean beliefs.
And so historically, Adam has been important since ancient times.
No argument there, but then that's also true of Krishna.
And Adam is still important, except that he's systematically being attacked by people who don't want to believe in him.
Not being believed in isn't an attack. And it's not that people don't want to believe in him, it's just that he can't have existed based on all the data that we have. I don't want to attack Adam any more than I want to attack Hercules, another legendary figure from ancient times that used to be widely believed in, but who didn't exist.
And so let's just think about this. Why would we, as a Christian, want to deny Adam?
Because Christians are supposed to care about what's true, and a literal Adam as believed in by young earth creationists never existed. So believing in it is believing something that's not true. And so if a Christian cares about truth, they won't believe in that. It's actually pretty simple. Of course, we already know from the first episode that Sanford is very open about not caring about truth or evidence. I'd say that might make him a bad Christian, but then I'm not his pastor, priest, confessor, or anything else.
Why would we do that? I mean, we're called by God to believe him and obey him. And so
reality doesn't matter.
If we are unbelievers, we can't assume we're going to heaven.
Okay.
Appeal to emotion much?
And if you have unbelief in the book of Genesis, why are you going to believe the rest of the Bible?
I don't know or care. I'm here for some alleged evidence of the claim from the Bible, not emotional appeals about going to hell or heaven or whatever. Plus, remember when the idea of the Christian hope after death was the resurrection of the dead? Like it says in the Bible? Weird how Sanford doesn't seem to really care about that. It's almost like the parts of the Bible he concerns himself with are arbitrary, and he ignores the parts of the Bible that don't suit him. It's almost like he has no actual principles and is an entirely emotionally driven idiot.
And so this idea of submitting to Christ and believing him, that's enough. Apart from science, just knowing God and his scripture, we should know and honor him.
How much more blatant could it be that he has nothing? Just if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, you're not a real Christian. Okay, cool. That's still not evidence. Instead, it's just a really good reason to not be a Christian if you care about truth at all. Almost like it's a really dumb idea to tie Christianity to a belief in a literal Adam and Eve.
Okay, today there may be if you figure out how many billion people are in the world who are Christian and how many billion people are Muslim, it amounts to more than half of humanity believes in Adam.
No, that would require the knowledge that all Muslims and Christians believe in Adam. That is a demonstrably false claim. Not all of them do. There's no way to know how many of them do unless you do extensive polling, something I see no reason to think Sanford has done.
So people who are brushing Adam aside, that's just like that's children's stories. No, this is more than half of humanity.
Well, it might be, but I doubt it. And further, argumentum ad populum doesn't become not fallacious when a former geneticist does it. So this is a whole lot of nothing, even if it were true.
Okay, biblical genealogies from Adam. Well, let's see. Adam was the first generation, right? That's Genesis 2. Abraham, 21 generations later. David, 34 generations later. Jesus, 77 generations.
If only the genealogies of Jesus weren't contradictory. Oh well.
These numbers are very systematic and very consistent.
Yeah, when you make things up for numerological reasons, you get consistent numbers. Who knew?
They are literal genealogies.
As opposed to a figurative genealogy? I don't even know what that is. Give me your best guess as to what the heck a figurative genealogy is in the comments.
There's no reason to question the genealogies here.
Except that they contradict each other. That seems like a big reason to doubt them.
And so we know, basically, all of Jesus' ancestors.
No, we have contradictory reports of his ancestors that were made up decades after his death. There are no sources cited for them. They are not contemporaneous to any of the people mentioned, and they can't both be true.
All the way back to Adam. That's pretty cool.
And there are European monarchs with genealogies that allegedly go back to Odin. That's pretty cool in the same way, in that
everybody's so creative.
And by the way, Dr. John, I know some people use the argument, well, they might have skipped somebody, so we don't really know how old it is and the times. And that's what I find interesting is I go, look, the reality is it comes with dates as well. So that whole argument of if they skipped somebody goes to pot because they give us the dates. Adam was 130, Seth was 105, Enos was 90, and the dates are right there. So if you that's another argument that you can just kind of wash aside that doesn't fit because we've got this data from Scripture.
Yeah.
That seems like some kind of desperate attempt to rescue some amount of historicity for Genesis 1 and 2 while acknowledging the ancient age of the earth. Since these two aren't arguing for it, I don't care to comment on it. That seems like some creationist internal fighting, and I say,
let them fight.
So
it's stunning. By God's grace, He's given us so much evidence.
Weird how none of it has been presented here.
And so the generations and the genealogies are wonderfully preserved in the Bible.
Shame they contradict when it comes to Jesus. Also, of course, the Septuagint has different numbers, and we know it was translated from older manuscripts than the Masoretic texts. So it's quite likely that they actually have been changed in one or both traditions. So we can't even be sure the original names and numbers are even available to us in any manuscript.
And so why would a Christian want to denigrate that?
A concern for history and truth, probably. Academic honesty might also be a factor.
Throughout the world, people honor their genealogies, except till now.
Given how much time people spend doing genealogy work today, I don't think that has changed. It's just that when a genealogy goes back to Odin or Vishnu or Zeus or Noah, we tend to be a bit skeptical.
So, of course, we trust them. And many modern genealogies go back to Adam. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but there are many people in Europe who are descended from Charlemagne.
A verifiable, real historical figure whose existence is documented in numerous contemporary artifacts and texts. That's a little different from a legendary proto-human made from clay.
And Charlemagne had a genealogy that went all the way back to Christ.
You mean the guy who most people believe didn't have any kids? That's a neat trick. But also, Jesus, while less well-established historically than Charlemagne, is also probably a real guy who existed.
Wow.
And so there are people who have genealogies that go back to Christ.
I feel like that should be a problem for the idea of credulously accepting genealogies as a Christian.
That's stunning.
No, it's not stunning at all. Most genealogies were made up to give a lie to excuse the political authority of the reigning dynasty. All states throughout all time have had a problem. They do things that would normally be considered morally aberrant if random citizens did them, so they need some rationalization as to why they should be allowed to do those things. Why their taxes aren't theft, why their corvée labor mandates aren't just enslavement, why their imprisonments aren't just kidnapping. In much of history, the lie that excused that was the divine right of kings, and a fancy lineage helped to sell that. Today, it's usually a manufactured or entirely fictional pretense of consent of the governed, and bits of paper that governments pretend both limit them and authorize them. People today construct lies to excuse state actors, and people in the past did as well. The fact that the lies are different doesn't make those things not lies, and that's what those genealogies are. They're made-up lies to convince people that when the king takes away their livelihood to pay for a war in a place they'd never heard of, or demands they build him a new castle with their own labor without their consent, that it's okay. Because Deus Vult. It's bullshit, and frankly, it's disgusting that Sanford is just swallowing the horse manure and telling us it's divine.
I just think that's so exciting.
This is the worst.
And it turns out that that's not just in Europe. The Muslims, it says 150 generations because approximately, if we assume Jesus was the 77th generation,
which we have no good reason to do,
then we've continued to have generations. So about 150 generations fits with both the Europeans and the Arabs. And the Arabs go all the way back to Ishmael and then back to Adam.
Wow. You mean a different group of people with the same names in their holy scriptures use the same made-up lies to justify their immoral actions as sanctified by God?
I am shocked. Shocked.
And so people are throwing out all this wonderful heritage and history just because
just because they're not willing to buy into obvious medieval political propaganda. Yeah, what a weird thing to do.
Actually, let's save it for later. Why do people reject what is obviously true?
He said without a hint of irony.
Actually, let's save it for later. Why do people reject what is obviously true? And
Great question.
Their faith and their hope in heaven relies upon it, and yet they say that stuff doesn't matter.
Well, I guess there it is. It's also a fear of death, because apparently, according to Sanford, if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, you're going to hell. I've never actually heard of that being the official doctrine of any church, but maybe Sanford and Hovind are starting their own church of Adam and Christ, where the central figure is Adam.
Of course it matters. That's why God wrote it down for us.
The Bible was written by humans, and in the case of Genesis, it was written by several humans and then stitched together by yet another human.
So now we're going to jump into genetics. Okay.
Back when John was a scientist, that was his field, so hopefully we get at least a single valid argument out of him on this topic.
Point is, it's not just genetics, but genetics is, by God's grace, he's giving us evidence. Why? Because
he knows that a book isn't really enough reason on its own to believe something, especially when it wasn't even close to being written contemporaneously to the topics it covers, as in Genesis.
The times are so evil, and because there's so many bad things happening, he's saying, look, this is kind of hard for you guys, you Christians. I'm going to give you a pass, and even though you should believe me by faith.
Well, you heard it here, folks. For Sanford, faith means believing things for no rational reason.
I'm going to give you a bunch of evidence that will fortify your faith.
Okay, let's see what evidence the Almighty deems good enough to convince everyone that Adam and Eve existed. 7
genetic evidences supporting a literal Adam and Eve. I hope you're all waiting. This is going to take 2 or 3 hours. I hope you don't mind.
Honestly, at this point, if it was hours of arguments whose conclusions actually followed from their premises, then I wouldn't mind. It would actually be something to respond to beyond just pointing out that Sanford's points don't actually give us a reason to believe Adam was real, even if his premises are correct. Which, to be fair, some of them were.
We're going to talk about mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, population bottlenecks, designed variants within the genome, the Babel dispersion, ape to man refuted, and genetic entropy.
We only have 13 minutes left with Sanford here. So he's going to talk about all of these in less than 2 minutes each on average. It's almost like maybe these should have been the whole point, rather than confessions that he didn't have any good reason to reject science, and that unsurprisingly, Adam and Eve are in the Bible.
Okay, so hang on, here we go. Evidence number 1, mitochondrial Eve. Google mitochondrial Eve, you'll find out that the whole world, including the scientific world, thinks that all of the human beings on this planet come from one woman.
Well, kind of. In fact, even if Eve existed, there's a good chance she wouldn't actually be mitochondrial Eve. Rather, one of her descendants would be. You see, mitochondrial Eve is the most recent common mitochondrial ancestor of extant humans. So it's not so much a person as it is a title which can and has and will change in terms of who holds it. Someone alive today may become a future mitochondrial Eve. Think about this in terms of your own family. You got your mitochondria from whomever provided the ovum that was fertilized by a sperm to become the zygote that grew into you. That ovum contained mitochondria, and they became your mitochondria. Now, I don't want to assume your family history or anything about gender, but for the sake of ease, I'm going to call the person who gives their mitochondria a mother. Your mother got her mitochondria from her mother, your grandmother. She got it from her mother, your great-grandmother, and so on. But let's look forward. Let's say that your mother has 3 children. 1 girl who can pass on mitochondria and 2 boys who cannot. Well now, we know that the boys aren't going to pass on her mitochondria, but let's say that just by chance, the girl herself has 3 kids. But all of them are boys. Your mom's mitochondrial line has now died out. But note that her genetic legacy has not. In fact, if we assume that all her children, including you, have, say, 3 children, she now has 9 grandchildren, all of whom have her DNA, just not her mitochondrial DNA. But if all we look at is mitochondria, your mom is invisible to us. Instead, other mothers contributed their mitochondrial DNA to your mom's lineage. So it's pretty obvious how a mitochondrial lineage can die out. If a mother's descendants fail to produce future mothers at any point, even if it produces fathers, then boom, the lineage is gone, even though the nuclear or autosomal DNA isn't. Now let's do the reverse. Let's say that your mother has all future mothers. Except maybe for you, since I don't know you or your reproductive capacity or intentions. Now let's say that humans colonize Mars, and just by chance, all the people there who can produce ova and bear children are part of her mitochondrial lineage. Then something happens, and humans on Earth are wiped out. Well, guess what? Now your mother is the mitochondrial Eve of the human species. Now this does not have to happen because of some cataclysm. Over time, just by chance, some mitochondrial lineages will spread and others will shrink. And so at any given time, there is a mathematical certainty that there will be a coalescent ancestor genome for mitochondria among extant members of a species. But that does not make this ancestor the first mother, nor does it mean that there were not other mothers at the time, nor does it mean that those other individuals do not have living descendants. Now, if Eve existed, she could be mitochondrial Eve, but does not need to be. So in conclusion, the existence of a coalescent ancestor for mitochondrial DNA is not in the least evidence for a historical biblical Eve.
But they say, but it's not Eve. Yes, we do have evidence that there's a single woman who gave rise to all the mitochondria on the planet, but don't think it's Eve.
Yes, because there's no reason to think that it is. Once again, we have an argument that isn't even valid. Both the young Earth creationists and scientific models of human history involve a mitochondrial Eve. Now, conveniently, we can actually test how long ago this person would have lived, and it's on the order of hundreds of thousands of years ago, not thousands of years ago. So it still doesn't help out young Earth creationist versions of Eve, but it fits in fine with a genealogical Eve like Swamidass has proposed, and like we mentioned earlier in the series.
So they originally started calling her mitochondrial Eve.
Yep, they did, because it's an evocative title. Just like when we call a big old crater on Mars Hellas Planitia, even though it's nowhere near Greece. Or we call a bit of Venus Aphrodite Terra, despite the fact that very few, if any, astronomers believe in Aphrodite. Look, I think it's fairly well known that I am not now and have never been Muslim. However, for various reasons, I really like the story of Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem and from there to the heavens. As a result, I have several times named things in background material for art projects or TTRPG games after his means of conveyance, al-Buraq. Does that mean that I actually think Muhammad rode on the back of a winged horse with a human head to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and then went up to heaven? No, of course not. If he even told that story, I think he was lying. Even in the sources, it kinda sounds like he's making shit up as he goes along, but I don't care. I like the story, so I reference it. That's all the scientists did when they came up with the name Mitochondrial Eve.
And later they decided to just call her the first, or they used a term for it, I can't think of it, but...
Our expert in genetics, ladies and gentlemen, dinosaurs and others, There are a number of accurate things you can call mitochondrial Eve, such as the most recent common mitochondrial ancestor, the mitochondrial coalescent point, etc. The difference is that rather than being a fun evocative title, they're just descriptive, which is also good, just for different reasons.
They tried to get rid of Eve.
I mean, I just did a Google Scholar search for mitochondrial Eve and restricted the results to from January 1st, 2024 until present, and I'm writing this on January 23rd, 2025. So basically the previous 13 months or so. 1,330 results came back. When I did the same but restricted the date range to January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020, I got 1,260 results, which is basically the same. So I see no evidence to say that there is any suppression of the term mitochondrial Eve. It seems like it's been in steady use for at least the past 4 years. Heck, if I only check the year 2000, it comes up 373 times. So it looks like it might be gaining in popularity. I would be fascinated to see what evidence Sanford has that there is some conspiracy to erase the term mitochondrial Eve from the scientific vocabulary. Surely he must have some, and it's not just made up, right?
Now they don't use that term anymore because it's so clear that there's only one way, only one woman could give rise to all of humanity, and that would be by literal Eve.
Well, since I already covered this, let's just move on.
She is called by everybody the mother of us all.
That's because if you look at your mom and her mom and her mom and so on, only with moms, we all get back to the same mom eventually. That does not make her the first mom, or the only mom contemporary to her. Because if you do something else, like perhaps look at your mom's dad, and then his mom, then his dad, some people will not converge on that same person. And there's also no reason to think that the person all humans converge to when only looking down an unbroken line of mothers did not herself have a mother.
And all our mitochondrial chromosomes.
Mitochondria each only have one chromosome, and it's circular, just like a bacterial genome. Because fundamentally, mitochondria are symbiotic bacteria that live inside eukaryotic cells.
Come from one woman.
Yup, as demanded by standard population genetics. And remember, she lived far too long ago to be the Eve Sanford believes in.
Is that like sort of interesting? Maybe?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's just that it provides evidence against Sanford's idea of a historical Eve.
I think so.
I mean, especially in light, when we contrast it with evolution, which says, no, it's populations that evolved over time. And so we wouldn't have come from one, ape ancestor that ended up evolving, which is what William Lane Craig is buying into now.
Mitochondrial Eve was a Homo sapiens. She wasn't any ancestral species, and the fact that other parts of the genome have even longer coalescent times on its own means that she wasn't the first member of that species. So Eric is just imagining that mitochondrial Eve is something we know she was not. In this case, I don't think he's doing it intentionally. Eric is not a very smart man, although he was smart enough to cut his abusive criminal father out of his life and the life of his children. And I think he is just accepting what Sanford is telling him credulously. But the result is that he is strawmanning mitochondrial Eve and coming to conclusions that simply are contrary to what the evidence is concerning her.
It seems like the evidence, you're right, goes right to one woman versus a population of women.
For that to be the case, the coalescent times for mitochondrial Eve would have to at least match the time to the most recent 4 alleles for the rest of the genome, or be longer than it, with no part of the autosomal genome having longer time to the most recent 4 alleles than the coalescent time for the mitochondrial genome. That is not the case, so no, the evidence does not show that.
Right. So basically, the people who reject this data are basically have just, stuck their head in the ground.
I mean, that's true. It's just that those people are young Earth creationists. They are the ones who reject the measured coalescence times, not just for mitochondrial DNA, but also for the Y chromosome, and for basically all parts of the rest of the genome.
And they just don't want to hear it.
Projection! Projection! Okay, first, scientists don't think about you, John. They're not trying to undermine anything. They're just trying to learn about the world through the tools of science. Second, many Christians manage to get along just fine while accepting the scientific conclusions about human origins. So even if this were designed to undermine God, His Word, or His people, it's doing a really bad job of it.
It has to do with deliberately trying to undermine God and God's people.
Okay, the only thing I can think of that could mean that isn't completely bonkers is that Sanford thinks that the book of Genesis was faithfully transmitted to us, And while there are problems with that, such as that we know that the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts, our two oldest witnesses to Genesis, differ, and the former has older manuscripts, meaning that there is good reason to suppose that one or both have been altered somewhat from an earlier manuscript tradition now lost to us. And I tend to think it's both, but the Septuagint probably more. I will say that I do think that the level of textual preservation in Genesis from ancient times is pretty good. However, I think that's probably giving Sanford too much credit, and I think he's about to say something far, far more dumb than just that our current manuscripts of Genesis are reliable.
And so this is very serious business. But what's interesting is God got it to us in spite of everybody, the evolutionists' desire to suppress this.
I mean, I was right, and yeah, it makes sense that now that we're in the genetics section, we're getting a genetics argument. This paper is indeed by Rob Carter, and it was published in a real science journal. It curiously steers clear of ever mentioning Eve, the age of the Earth, any way to calculate how long ago the ancestral genome existed, out of Babel, the flood, or anything like that. It also just concludes that a consensus mitochondrial genome can be reconstructed for humans, which isn't exactly surprising, although it is interesting. I'm not sure how Sanford is going to pretend this helps his case.
Okay, evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about Eve's mitochondrial DNA consensus sequence. That's a mouthful.
Yep, then you try to figure out if you can reconstruct the original. And the original is the consensus text. Got it.
A consensus sequence means that, let's suppose you have 1,000 people. Let's suppose then you've given them all the same book, and then you come in and you change letters.
He then goes on to say that he actually helped with this paper and should be a co-author, but that it wouldn't have been published with both of their names on it. I find that unlikely, but whatever.
We just call it mitochondrial diversity within modern human populations. So we didn't want to say Eve because we would knew that in the mainstream journals they would not tolerate a paper like that.
Weird how real scientists won't just drag their journals through the mud by letting cranks publish things that make unwarranted conclusions that are precluded by the data that are actually found in the world. It's probably a conspiracy to make reality look right and make made-up stuff look not right.
But it's just stunning.
I don't know how it's stunning or how it's supposed to be evidence for Eve. At least not any more than the bare existence of mitochondrial Eve is supposed to be evidence for it.
This is one way of... So Rob looked at all, I think 800 women from all over the world.
All over the world, except that the paper itself points out that it is missing data in geographically significant ways, and even points out that Africa, the place with the most human genetic diversity, is particularly poorly sampled.
To kind of find out where the consensus would be. And then we were able to find the red dot there is the mitochondrial consensus sequence.
Wow.
Now, because there have been thousands of years between now and Eve,
Hundreds of thousands.
You'll see that all of the blue dots are the different women.
Those dots represent genomes, not women. And in fact, you can sample mitochondrial DNA from men. They still have it, and it still falls into the exact same group as that from women. It's just that cis men don't pass on mitochondrial DNA, so their children won't correlate with their mitochondrial DNA.
And some of them have spread further, but they're all diverging away from the original. So,
yep, that sure is how mutation accumulation works. I'm not really sure what the argument is supposed to be. Like, does Sanford think that evolutionary biologists think that over time diverse genomes should come together to form a single unvarying genome? Because I guess they mutate to be more alike? Because that's not something any biologist I've ever heard of thinks. And it's really not how math works. If you can figure out how this is supposed to help him, please let me know.
Red is the past of Eve, the ancient sequence.
It's the consensus genome, which is hypothesized as the ancestral genome. So yes, it's in the past, but there isn't a past axis or anything like that on this graph, so calling it the past is a bit weird. Also, based on what Sanford is telling us, it seems like all the blue dots represent extant genomes, meaning that there really is no way in which time is represented on this chart.
And the blue is the modern day people coming from her.
Okay, I was right. Time is not represented here.
And what we see is, it's very clear that we're seeing, we can go in and we know the sequence. We know her sequence for her mitochondria.
Well, first, no, the consensus genome does not necessarily represent the actual ancestral genome. It probably does in basically any one place, but it's possible that after a split from the common ancestor, two lines could happen to both have the same mutation somewhere, and this mutation would be recovered as the consensus. So the consensus is probably very close to the genome of the most recent mitochondrial ancestor, but there's no way to say it's completely identical.
We know her genetic DNA.
But what about her non-genetic DNA? Jokes aside, I still fail to see how this is supposed to be evidence of Eve. No one disagrees that there was at some point a most recent common ancestor for human mitochondrial DNA. That's essentially a mathematical inevitability. And at most, all this seems to do is provide evidence for something we already know, but not for any of Sanford's views in particular.
That's
The woman
amazing.
that most people say never existed, but who clearly is the first woman to give rise to humanity.
First, no one that I'm aware of says that mitochondrial Eve never existed. Her existence is basically a mathematical certainty, but it's also not evidence of a historical Eve, who, even if she existed, might not actually be mitochondrial Eve anyway. So basically, all Sanford and Carter did, from what I can tell, is just give us a consensus genome that is probably close to the mitochondrial genome of mitochondrial Eve, which isn't at all evidence for historical Eve from the Bible. I don't see how the logical through line is supposed to go. It's like pointing out that the Bible portrays Jesus as a man and then pointing to the fact that men exist as compelling evidence for the historical reliability of the canonical Gospels.
So amazing.
It's not.
Here we have the rings. The rings mean 50 mutations. So you'll see within that ring, most of these less than 50 mutations have accumulated within the first ring. And then there are people further out who have more mutations.
Yep, not sure how that's supposed to help, but okay.
We're all mutating, and we all different parts of our chromosomes are mutating. But what we see is this dispersion coming out of the original Eve.
But that's what you're going to see when focusing on any part of the genome and tracing it back to its coalescent point. That's what mutations do. They increase genetic diversity. And all parts of the genome have a coalescent point representing the most recent common ancestor for that part of the genome. Like, this is true regardless of the historical existence of Adam or Eve. And further, we can measure how long it has been since the actual existence of this common ancestor. And guess what? It's a couple of orders of magnitude too much for Sanford's idea in terms of the Y chromosome and mitochondria, and even worse in terms of the rest of the human genome. So this does not help at all. There is far too much diversity, and the bare existence of diversity coming from an ancestral genome is non-dispositive.
I'm in Florida, which is just south of Alabama, and I see some of those dots way out there with a whole lot of mutations, Dr. Sanford. I think I've met some of them up in Alabama.
And here's Eric being a bigoted asshole. I guess that's not surprising.
How long ago did Eve live?
That's a nonsensical question, since we haven't even begun to establish that she lived at all.
Well, we found that on average, the typical person who's come from Eve has 21 mutations different from Eve.
Okay, well, that's nice trivia, but it's meaningless to the question. See, if we assume that the coalescent point for mitochondrial DNA is in fact just Eve from the Bible, which again, we know it's not, then in order to date how long ago she lived, we have to use the maximum divergence, not the average divergence. Now, the graph had 3 rings, each representing 50 mutations that have accumulated, and his most distant data points were between the mark for 100 and 150, so let's just assume 125. Or more than 3 times more than what he's going with here. That means that even if we ignore the fact that he's using mutation rates instead of known substitution rates, which is malpractice on its own, since most mutations do not persist, we get a time to Eve of 31,250 years, well outside the range of any young Earth creationist timeline. But hey, let's see what he does.
Pretty small number, really, although that chromosome is quite small.
Which is completely irrelevant, but whatever.
So basically, we approximately the mutation rate for that chromosome, the mitochondrial chromosome, 0.1 per generation. So that's rough.
Which is inappropriate, since we know that as we measure across more and more generations, the rate of accumulation of novel mutations starts to go down. This is for very obvious reasons. Selection and drift act to reduce genetic diversity. Unless Sanford wants us to believe that there is literally no drift and no selection acting on the mitochondria of humans, then the mutation rate cannot be the actual accumulation rate across many generations. Indeed, creationists often use rates that are around an order of magnitude or more greater than the measured replacement rates in humans. And if we add an order of magnitude onto our back-of-the-envelope calculation based on Sanford's numbers to account for the difference between mutation and substitution rates, we recover an approximate time that mitochondrial Eve would have lived of about 300,000 years ago, and the consensus date is about 200,000 years ago, which goes to show why we both know that the young Earth timeline is wrong, and why Sanford's alleged evidence of Eve is nothing of the sort.
So that's roughly how many mutations per generation. So we're getting new mutations every generation.
most of which will not persist in the long term, making this kind of grandmother to mother to daughter mutation rate higher than the actual rate at which mutations will accumulate across many generations. And by many, I don't mean thousands, I mean scores. And it's not like creationists don't understand that things like drift and selection reduce genetic diversity. They use it as a talking point about how you can't get anatomical or biochemical novelty from the mechanisms of evolution. They're wrong about that conclusion, but it's not like they're wrong that those things reduce genetic diversity. If you ignore mutations, you get the prediction that diversity declines. If you forget drift and selection, you get outsized rates of genetic diversity increase. You have to include both, or you're just ignoring hugely important parts of how population genetics works. Sanford is just ignoring selection and drift and pretending that by this rather obvious lie, and also cherry-picking his starting point, he can show that mitochondrial Eve is Eve, and that the timelines match up. But hey, if you want to ignore reality, and lie and cheat on top of that to show that you're right, it probably just means that you're wrong. Now recently, at the time of this writing, one Dr. Robert Carter has tried to argue that selection and drift do not apply to the haploid portions of the human genome, i.e. the mitochondria and Y chromosomes, in terms of differentiating the pedigree mutation rate and the long-term substitution rate. Of course, that's silly and dumb, and just by chance, as a lineage accumulates mutations, it may go extinct, eliminating all of those mutations. Similarly, if some mutation in the Y chromosome lowers the fitness of males who carry it, they will be less likely to pass on their Y chromosome, and so when their lineage goes extinct, it will take all those mutations on the Y chromosome that have accumulated with it. Further, this isn't even a question we have to ask. We have measured the difference between Y chromosome mutation rates and substitution rates, and they're not even close to the same.
So we just combine 21 accumulated mutations with the rate of 0.1, and we get 210 generations since Eve.
Cool. Now let's try it with the actual important number of mutations, the maximum divergence, which is closer to 125, and then a more reasonable accumulation rate that does not pretend that selection and drift don't exist, which is more like 0.01. If we divide 125 by 0.01, we get 12,500 generations. This would give us a generation time of 16 years for humans if we assume that 200,000 years for mitochondrial Eve is right. That's a bit low, but also Sanford's estimate of 25 is probably a bit high for a historical estimate. So whatever, based on some very basic assumptions that crucially take into account the real world, we're currently at about 12,500 generations for mitochondrial Eve. It's probably a bit less, so let's be generous and cut it in half. So 6,250 generations.
And since a generation is about 25 years long?
It's usually between 20 and 30 now, but in the past it would have skewed younger. So I think 20 is a far more reasonable time frame. Note that this is actually more generous to creationists than the generation time Sanford is using. One generous group of people are my patrons and channel members. So if you're enjoying my content and you want to help keep it getting made, I encourage you to check out my Patreon and pledge there or join the channel. The Patreon starts at only $1 a month, and the membership's at only $1.99 a month. Patreon has a 15% discount if you pledge annually. Both give you early access to videos like this, as well as access to my super secret Discord server. Also, why not like the video since you've gotten this far in, and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to turn on notifications in the hopes that YouTube will actually take seriously your desire to see my content.
We get a time frame for Eve. The time frame is 5,250 years ago.
Except it's not, though. It's more like 125,000 years ago, with me being absurdly generous to young Earthers, but refusing to just ignore drift and selection, and also refusing to cherry-pick the wrong amount of divergence from the coalescent ancestor. Oops. So I've now run this basic calculation twice, once while not being particularly nice to creationism, and once while being absurdly generous to creationism. And I got 31,125 in one instance, and 125,000 in the other. No matter which way you look at it, the only way to get the young Earth number is to lie about reality. Because I know Sanford knows that drift and selection are real, and I know that he knows that he needs to account for maximum divergence, not average divergence. Once again, if you think I'm wrong, that he's lying, please tell me why you think that he's a moron in the comments. I don't think he is a moron. I think he's a man smart enough to be a PhD researcher in genetics. You know, because that used to be his job.
Very close to 6,000 years is the time since Eve and how many mutations have accumulated within people since Eve.
How about that? All you have to do to show that Eve existed is lie about what mitochondrial Eve is, lie about whether or not selection and drift are real, and then cherry pick your data anyway. It's hard to even imagine a way it could be more convincing that Sanford is a liar.
Is that stunning?
Yes, it is stunning, in that this amount of academic fraud is hard to believe.
It is, because
mind-blowing.
genetically, mitochondrial DNA is saying there seems to be a recent ancestor in our genetics.
I guess it depends on if you think hundreds of thousands of years is recent or not. It's not according to young Earth creationism, but I guess it is compared to how long ago the Cambrian was.
And it's fitting more the biblical timeline than anything even close to an evolutionary or old Earth creation timeline.
Well, yeah, when you're willing to lie and cherry pick, you can get any answer you want. I want to be more clear about why it's the maximum divergence that he has to account for. Let's say that you had a group of pedestrians, all of whom started at the same building and then walked for a while. None of them are particularly tired, so it wasn't a brisk or fast walk. It was probably a leisurely walk of about 3 miles an hour or less. Now, most of them walked about 2 to 3 miles, and you figure that they've been walking for less than an hour. But one of them has managed to get 18 miles. So either that person walked faster than most people can sprint, and did it for 18 miles, or your estimate for how long ago everybody set off from their starting point, based on the average distance walked, is way off. It is similar. If the average divergence is 21 mutations, but there are some mitochondrial lineages with more than 100 mutations, you need to account for them too.
And so basically, this means that systems are breaking down.
No, it doesn't. This requires the assumption that all mutations observed compared to his consensus genome are deleterious. He has nowhere ever actually demonstrated that. He's just assuming the truth of genetic entropy to make this statement. But genetic entropy is unfathomably wrong and stupid, as has already been explained at length in both this series as well as elsewhere.
So the consensus sequence would be the perfect sequence.
He has done nothing to demonstrate that. He hasn't even proposed a way to measure so-called perfection in a genome. Also, I have to point out, talking about perfect genetics really, really sounds a whole lot like eugenics, and is probably a bad idea. We know where the idea of eugenics goes, and at best, it's the forced sterilization of black women in what was once the United States. And at worst, it's just the actual Holocaust.
First sequence, all the rest, we just keep getting more and more mutations.
Once again, I don't even know what he actually said there. The audio quality on his end is atrocious. It's like he doesn't even want to be understood. He needs to hire a tech guy to at least do some basic setup on his streaming rig.
So now let's take a look at evidence 2, which is Y chromosome Adam. Okay.
Well, first, I bet this will be directly parallel to the mitochondrial Eve discussion, so nothing even remotely compelling will be offered. And he'll probably once again depend on lying. Second, the reason he's focusing on the Y chromosome is that, like the mitochondria, it is inherited from one parent and does not undergo crossover with other chromosomes. This makes the math surrounding the coalescence of the Y chromosome easier than it is for the rest of DNA, just like with the mitochondrial genome.
So this is a bigger chromosome, but we're going to do the same type of analysis.
The only difference the size of the chromosome makes is how long your computer has to crunch numbers and how big the mutation and substitution rates are likely to be.
So you can Google Y chromosome Adam, and what does it say?
Okay, I Googled it in Chrome in an incognito tab. This is so Google doesn't use my search history to bias the results. It says, Y chromosomal Adam is the most recent common male ancestor of all living humans. He is the earliest male from whom all living humans can trace their lineage through an unbroken line of male ancestors. That's the AI overview, and despite the fact that AI just makes stuff up all the time, that seems a pretty reasonable answer to me.
It says that all Y chromosomes come from one man.
Yep, that's still required by math, and it's true for all other parts of the genome too, except that we can't determine the sex of the individual from whom all of us got that section of our genome. And it still in no way implies that that man was the only man who existed, or even the only man from the time with living descendants. Just that he's the guy that you get to if you trace Y chromosomes from son to father to grandfather to great-grandfather, and so on, as the first guy all lines lead to. But there is literally no reason to think he was the only male alive at the time, or that he did not himself have a father whose Y chromosome he inherited. And also, at least according to the Bible, he'd be Noah or one of his descendants, not Adam. Unless, of course, Mrs. Noah was stepping out and not telling her husband. But hey, I'll leave that idea to the people writing Genesis cuck fanfiction. You do you crazy kids.
What's the chances of that?
According to evolution, like 100%?
Even if even if Eve was filled with a world of similar women,
which mitochondrial Eve was,
and they all died, and she just happened to stay there.
What the actual No, they all lived perfectly ordinary lives, mitochondrial Eve too. No one at the time would have noticed any particular difference between her and all the other females around having babies, many of whom were themselves female. I have no idea what kind of weird strawman fantasy Sanford is imagining as the mainstream view of how the coalescent ancestors for given parts of the genome work.
How then would there be just one man?
The same way. Over that time, that lineage became overrepresented as other lineages died out, and eventually it was the only one left of all the lineages that existed at the time the individual who is now Y chromosome Adam lived. And if you went back in time, there would have been an even older Y chromosome Adam, and since then, more lineages of Y chromosome diversity have died out. Like, as an example, different lineages of the Y chromosome are called haplogroups. The most divergent haplogroup is A, which means that Y chromosome Adam is the most recent male line ancestor of A and all other haplogroups. But if the A lineage went extinct, which would not require all the people in Y chromosome haplogroup A to die or fail to reproduce, just to have fewer male offspring on average than other lineages over time, then the identity of the Y chromosomal Adam would shift to the common ancestor of haplogroups B and the rest. That will shift the time to Y chromosome Adam up like 50,000 years, and obviously to a new individual. That doesn't mean that the earlier Y chromosome Adam didn't exist, or that the new one was the only male around. We know he couldn't have been, because earlier there were people from other haplogroups that were not descended from him in terms of their Y chromosome.
It's coming from God.
What, basic math and population genetics? I mean, if you want to think those are from God, I won't stop you, but they certainly aren't helping the case for a historical Adam as seen in Genesis, or a historical Noah for that matter. But then perhaps there is something to the idea that God is telling us through basic math and population genetics to stop treating Genesis 1 through 11 as a history book.
I mean, God is showing us the things that most people don't want to see.
So I just did a Google Scholar search for Y chromosome Adam since the year 2024, the most recent past year as the time of my writing this. I also made sure that Adam was in quotes so that only papers that actually have that word come through. There were 7,120 results. I wouldn't count that as no one looking into the Y chromosome data. That seems like a whole lot of people were doing it. Let me know in the comments if you think Sanford made this up and has no clue how many people are working on data regarding the Y chromosome Adam, or if he does know and is just lying. In this case, I think it could go either way. Although, if he just doesn't know, it does mean that he is not keeping up with the relevant literature, but speaking on it as if he has some authority, which would require him to keep up. So I guess to some extent, both options end up with Sanford being a liar, just in different ways.
Because they don't want God.
Nothing about the existence of the mathematically required coalescent point for the Y chromosome in any way answers a question about whether God exists. At least not more than any other random logically necessary fact.
We now have an approximation of the Y chromosome sequence and its consensus.
So, okay, a direct parallel to everything we just went over with mitochondrial Eve, which means that this will be stupid for the same reasons. But also, I'm a little surprised that he hasn't pointed out that it should be Noah who's the Y chromosome Adam. Maybe he thinks that pointing out that the identity of Y chromosome Adam can shift will undermine his argument. If we take history as presented by young Earthers seriously, then until the flood, Noah was not Y chromosomal Adam. But then he was afterwards. This shows that there is no reason that Y chromosome Adam has to be the first man, or the only man, or even the only man with living descendants. For example, Noah's wife had a father who presumably was not Noah. The same is true for his sons' wives. This means that even if Noah is Y chromosome Adam, other men who were alive when he was have living descendants. It's just that to get to them, you have to go through a female line, like Noah's wife or daughters-in-law. If Y chromosome Adam doesn't have to be the first guy ever, then I guess it follows that mitochondrial Eve doesn't have to be the first gal ever. And the whole argument falls apart. Which, it does. At this point, the only interesting thing Sanford could do would be to mention Noah and talk about the implications. Let's see if he does that, shall we?
Spoiler! He does not.
And what we see is very little variation, which means it's young, like you say.
Sure, but just like when we run the numbers with mitochondrial variation, when we do it with the Y chromosome and also don't pretend that selection and drift are fake or that we don't need to take into account the maximum variance, we still get an answer a couple of orders of magnitude too big for young Earthers.
So Adam was recent, and so it's spread out more because it's a bigger chromosome. Each ring now is 200 mutations.
So at maximum, we seem to have about 700 mutations to account for. Cool.
The diagram is just like Eve. It's just that it's more diverse
Yep.
because it's a bigger chromosome.
Yep, we've already been over this. Sanford might be the worst public speaker among all the creationists I've ever encountered. And I've talked to some pretty bad ones.
And so, but basically the original sequence is in the middle, the red spot. That person is long gone, but the blue people are the descendants, and they are all diverging away from the first one.
Yep, that sure is how mutations from a reconstructed consensus genome at the time of coalescence works.
And so it's like stunning.
The only thing that's stunning is the mountain that Sanford is making out of a molehill of predicted data.
So how long ago did Adam live?
Okay, let's do this. We need to account for about 700 mutations, and the rate of mutation, according to Sanford, is about 1 per generation. But that's after ignoring selection and drift, making the real number more like 0.1 per generation. We get about 7,000 generations. Now, multiply that by our generous 20-year generation time, and we get 140,000 years ago. Neat! That's within what he claims as the conventional range of 57,000 to 340,000. Wow, it's almost like there's a good reason for those estimates.
People have claimed, evolutionists have claimed, that it's between 57,000 years and 340,000 years.
A claim Sanford's own data back up, as long as you don't forget that we live in the real world and also cherry pick.
That's a big gap.
No, it's a big range, and also it seems suspiciously big. And I keep seeing estimates from 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, which is a much smaller gap. So I think he's just cherry-picking early estimates, but I honestly don't care to check.
And also a long time frame. But when we did our research, the average accumulation was about 300 mutations per Y chromosome.
Which again is meaningless. You have to account for the maximum divergence, not the average.
And if we assume, if we know the rate, it's about 1 mutation per generation.
Once again, this depends on pretending that selection and drift are not real. An assumption that I have trouble imagining Sanford doesn't understand is nonsense.
So to get 300 mutations would be equivalent to getting about 300 generations.
Fun fact, the island of Tristan da Cunha was settled in about 1810 or so. That's more than 8 generations ago, according to the 25-year generation time Sanford likes. Their Y chromosomes have been sequenced, and they don't have 8 or 9 mutations that have accumulated. They have about 0, and a few people have a bit more. And we know they haven't been having immigration to the island that introduced new Y chromosomes. The Y chromosomes that are there are descended from those of the first British colonists, and there literally is no dated population from before them, as the island was discovered completely uninhabited by humans. So real-world data says that Sanford is full of shit.
So if we multiply by 25, because that's the generational time, what we find is that the original Y chromosome was about 7,500 years ago.
Yet again, when you ignore reality and cherry pick, you can come up with numbers that match your predetermined conclusion that you came to because you think it's keeping your marriage together.
Wow. About 6,000. Wow. Now, these are rough numbers. All of these are approximate.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
And if you do bigger studies, you might get more. But you'll find that to be anywhere near 6,000 speaks loud and clear of a recent and solitary Adam and Eve.
Nope, even if his math was right, Adam should be Noah. So why is he getting an age that's like 50% older than Noah should be? And just the fact that it should be Noah shows that even if his numbers were right, it doesn't mean either Y chromosome Adam or mitochondrial Eve are necessarily solitary or isolated. And there's no reason to think they ever met or reproduced with each other. In fact, since according to the young Earth conception of history, Y chromosome Adam is really Noah, we can be pretty well assured that Y chromosome Adam did not reproduce with their mitochondrial Eve. This whole argument falls apart even on its own basis. It's not even internally consistent. So it sure as hell can't be used as evidence of a historical Adam and Eve as described in the Bible. The only thing that it can actually give evidence of is that John Sanford is a fraud and a liar.
So when William Lane Craig, who's put it here, John Pinky's throwing this in here, he says William Lane Craig is saying somewhere around 750,000 years ago. He's off by an order of 10. I mean, it's...
First, I don't know if William Lane Craig has said anything of that kind. That's more than twice as long ago as any estimate I've seen, but also 750,000 divided by 7,500 is 100, not 10. But then again, given that creationists are routinely off by 7 or so orders of magnitude, I guess I'll let that one go.
That's way off from what the genetics is showing us today.
I mean, it is, but by a factor of about 2.5, whereas Eric and Sanford need to be off by a factor of 50 or so. So, they're off by a heck of a lot more.
And what, he's a philosopher. What knowledge is he basing this on?
I have no idea, but that's probably a question for Craig, not Hovind.
One of the things that I say over and over again is the issue is, who is your authority?
When it comes to science, there is no answer to who my authority is, because there is none. If I actually care to learn the truth of a matter, my authority is the empirical evidence. If I don't care, then I either remain agnostic or I accept the consensus of those whose authority is the evidence and who have dedicated their lives to figuring out what that evidence says.
You can honor God or you can honor man.
Which one is honored by lying about genetics? Because I feel like it's neither.
Who do you turn to for what you trust in?
When it comes to science, I turn to the empirical evidence.
And what the world wants mostly is to put their trust in the latest, movie star or president or whatever.
I mean, maybe on some topics, but I don't remember any presidents or movie stars talking about the dating of mitochondrial Eve or Y chromosome Adam. So I feel like that might not be relevant here.
But Christians, we should not be thinking that way. We should be thinking, well, if I had to choose between a fancy-dancy professor who's famous and Jesus Christ, I don't think it's going to be a very hard decision.
The decision is between an interpretation of a book that is at odds with reality and accepting reality as it is. I don't think that should be a hard decision, but I guess I'm wrong.
And so it has to do again with the issue of belief versus unbelief.
Actually, here I'll agree. It's between those Christians and not who believe the evidence and those who do not, like our two chucklefuls here.
And those who do not believe are offending the Lord in the most horrific way.
I hope that's true. God should be offended in the most horrific way by Sanford's refusal to believe the evidence all around him, and his insistence in spreading false teachings.
And so why do Christians question what is so clearly presented in Scripture?
Two main reasons: they don't share Sanford's interpretive framework, and because they care about actual evidence. I guess technically the second one isn't universal.
It's kind of mind-boggling. So
I did have a factor of 100, Andrew. Thank you. Off William Lane Craig off by a factor of 100.
Hey, someone on Hovind's staff can do arithmetic.
Dr. Sanford, I got to let social media go, but I want to answer a couple questions from them real quick. The idea that Charlemagne goes back to Christ, since Christ had no offspring, is that going back to Mary or Joseph, who did continue to have children? Is that kind of how they go back to, quote, Christ is going to actually, the brother of Jesus?
An actually intelligent question.
The brother of Jesus is what the genealogies of Charlemagne and other kings of Europe, they speak of, I think it was James.
James, okay.
James,
the brother of Jesus, yeah.
Oh, he thinks that. That seems like the kind of thing you'd want to look up first.
But the lineage was through, we don't know the genome of Jesus, but
right.
But Joseph and Mary, I think we don't have their sequence, but we know that their generations, their genealogies are very, very well preserved.
That is amazing.
It would be if we had anything to go on other than propaganda for whatever local tyrant was in charge. After Hovind reads Philippians 1:11, I don't really care, then it's just a commercial for the extended paid version of this video. I'm not giving Hovind my money, so I'm not going to play any more of this nonsense. Well, I guess the whole of this hour-long interview that I've now turned into a 3-hour-long response series was just one barely valid argument, that of the coalescence time to mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, but those failed on their own terms to be sound. I can't help but feel like Hovind and Sanford were just wasting my time. Oh well, if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.